listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
It's been a hell of a week for the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. It has ended with one of his members of Parliament being arrested for driving while drunk and smashing his car into a lamppost. You might think that's a metaphor for Boris Johnson's premiership. I couldn't possibly comment, except to say that that has been topped by new pictures just released in the British newspapers showing yet another breach of lockdown with Boris Johnson and his missus and what looks like all of their friends all out in the 10 Downing Street garden with their wine and cheese. The government says they were working. And of course, Boris Johnson has lost his right-hand man, Lord Frost, who was hardballing the EU and the Irish government. What happens next after that? Perhaps most importantly, he lost a parliamentary seat that the Tories have held for 200 years. I'm not making that up. And Omicron running riot, or is it? Deadly, or is it? We'll be looking at all of that. We'll be talking with America and with Britain, with China, with Hong Kong. We'll be talking about sex. Well, Sex in the City, which is kind of the same thing. So, this is rock and roll radio with pictures. Fasten your seatbelts. It's definitely going to be a bumpy ride because it is the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway.
This is Radio Sputnik.
Whenever I drive to London, which I don't normally do but did this weekend, I get as many subjects from listening to BBC Radio as I could fill 5 shows with. I don't know where to begin. Let me begin with Omicron. I listened to a BBC News, not comment, but news interview with sundry individuals in the field of the coronavirus. Scientists, doctors, and one nurse. I've got to tell you that if today's BBC had been the BBC in 1940, we would definitely have surrendered, just like all the others did on the European mainland. I listened to a BBC News interviewer where 3 times the interviewer used the word terrifying. He was terrified at figures which turn out actually not even to be true. But even if they were true, is it the job of the BBC to be terrified? Can't they leave that to the people they're interviewing? Why do they have to describe it as terrifying? Can you imagine it in 1940 and 41? The BBC talking about terrifying numbers of Junker 88s, Messerschmitt 109s swarming over the channel and attacking us. Terrified we would be. It was, frankly, stomach turning, not least because the data on which the terrifying questionnaire was being posed turned out not to be right. Everyone in Britain knows that everyone who was anyone said that Omicron cases were going to double every 2 days. Double every 2 days. Now, I'm no mathematician. In fact, I'm not even very good at maths. But I quickly worked out that that would mean that in 1 month, every single person on this island would be suffering from Omicron. I thought that's a bit of a stretch. That sounds like a tall tale. In fact, the number hasn't doubled, not in 2 days, not in 4, not in 5. The number fell today as opposed to yesterday. So I'm beginning to smell a rat on this COVID Omicron subject. Why are they exaggerating it? I can tell it's to push people into having the vaccinations. I don't need to be pushed. I've had both vaccinations. I'm waiting for the Scottish Health Service to furbish me with my booster. I'm not against vaccination. I am against lying. I am against deliberate exaggeration of a public health emergency which can have all kinds of unintended consequences. If it's not doubling, let's look at what it is doing. Omicron today has put 80 people in hospital, and until today has killed one person, or rather, one person has died with the Omicron present in their system. That person was over 70 years old. That person had not been vaccinated, and we don't yet know, because nobody will tell us, whether they had any comorbidities or underlying health problems. But one dead person and 80 hospitalizations does not a lockdown add up. If they destroy further the British economy, if they destroy further the mental health, the fragile mental health of people already suffering from 2 years of all of this, if they postpone indefinitely again all those people who are waiting for elective surgery, all those people who've got all those other medical problems but can't get a look in, or feel that they should not take a look in to the NHS because it's overwhelmed by Omicron, well, that would be a crime. That would be a crime against the British economy and thus the British people. It would be a crime against the mental health and the physical health of all of those currently being, to quote the BBC interviewer, terrified by Omicron. Now, I didn't get this off Big Senga on Facebook. I have deplored from the beginning of this pandemic the tendency of some to do their research, by which they mean surfing the World Wide Web and coming up with anything they found there as if it was necessarily true or as if the facts therein were incontestable. No, I'm basing this on a Dr. Coetzee. Dr. Coetzee is the woman doctor in South Africa that first identified Omicron and who told us that Omicron is about 28% as dangerous as the Delta, which was formerly the prevailing variant that was cutting a swathe through people all over South Africa and all over the world. Now, again, I'm not a mathematician. I'm definitely not a medical man. But even I can work out that if there is a massive increase in transmission of a variant that is massively less dangerous, that massively less dangerous variant will become the prevailing orthodoxy. And if it does, that's not bad news, That is good news. It's like it's going to give even these unvaxxed people a vaccination of sorts. It's going to give them the illness, and their natural immunity will respond. Do you see where I'm going with this? I'm saying that at this point, there is no argument for further lockdowns in Britain. And yet, Cobra met today. The Prime Minister was not at it, which may or may not be significant. But I hear from good sources that Parliament is to be recalled on Tuesday. And if Parliament is being recalled on Tuesday, and its business is to be a new lockdown in Britain, then I shall oppose it. Not because I'm a tinfoil hat wearer, not because I'm an anti-vaxxer, neither of which I am. You see, when the facts change, so do my opinions. And the facts as they are before us right now are that the Omicron variant of COVID-19 is not sufficiently traveling or affecting a sufficient number of people to justify the hype that is around it. It's not doubling every 2 days. The number yesterday was less than the number the day before. And doubling every 2 days is mathematically, inherently, extremely improbable in any case. But however widely it travels, if it is doing less harm than the variant it is supplanting, how would that be a reason for further devastating a British economy, a hospitality sector, already on its knees, already perhaps on the verge of a 2008-style crash? Discuss, we will. But that was, of course, only one of Boris Johnson's problems this week. He, on Thursday, lost a parliamentary constituency in North Shropshire, which the Tories had held for 200 years. Just think about that. 200 years! The people there have been returning a Tory MP, a constituency that voted 60% for Brexit, and where the Tories have been virtually unchallengeable always throughout that 200 years, except once. At the height of Corbyn mania in 2017, the Labour Party came close, closer than they ever have, to snatching it. Even in 2019, under the by then somewhat deflated Jeremy Corbyn, they still came second and they still got 12,000 votes. This time they came third. This time they were humiliated by the switching of Labour voters to the Liberal Democrats, who captured the seat. Labour is now, ex post facto, pretending that its candidate was only a paper candidate. But that's a lie, you see, because I've got the emails that they were sending out daily, sometimes twice daily, begging their activists to come to North Shropshire to avert exactly the humiliation that they, in the end, deservedly reaped. I've got the emails in which they beg their members for money so that they can fight the constituency harder in a by-election they're now pretending that they threw. But if it was bad for Keir Starmer, it was very much worse for Boris Johnson. It was a repudiation, as I predicted here last Sunday. My predictions are unerringly accurate in some regards, on political matters. I wish I could pick horse races quite so well. But I said last week that the Liberal Democrats were very likely to take this seat, and that if they did, Boris Johnson would be toast. And they did, and he's toast. Not just because he lost, but as Mr. Macmillan said, it's never one damn thing, it's one damn thing after another. And that second damn thing came last evening with the news that one of his cabinet ministers, his right-hand man, the man with the key job of negotiating with the European Union, was resigning in protest at the direction of travel of Boris Johnson's government. He cited COVID lockdowns, higher taxes, and one or two other matters, but he might well have said that Boris didn't quite get Brexit done, and that pressure was being put on him to soften his negotiating stance vis-à-vis the European Union, to concede areas that he had been negotiating hard to defend. We'll be talking to the doyen of psephologists, Professor Sir John Curtice, in a few minutes on all of this. We'll be talking to Rachel Blevins about the situation in the United States, about the political and the economic and one or two cultural matters that are rolling out in the United States. So make sure you stay tuned for all of that. And it's 80 years since Pearl Harbor, that day of infamy when Japanese fascism launched a sneak attack on the United States Navy based in Pearl Harbor on the Hawaiian Islands. A great loss of life, great loss of war materiel, undoubtedly suffered by the people of Hawaii and the United States Navy. Remembered forever, known about by most people. But what is not known about is that in Hawaii, the natives are getting restless. They're beginning to realize that for them, the United States cares little. They're only a naval base to them. Whilst they may have been given the status of the 50th state of the United States, they sure ain't treated with respect. We'll be talking to a member of Parliament in Hawaii, a former member of Parliament, a man who will be returning to the Parliament and indeed maybe even the US Senate in due course about these matters. Now look, I've got a poll running. Is Omicron, A, being taken seriously, or B, being exaggerated? Well, you already know my point of view. I'll be interested in yours. You can vote on my Twitter feed, on my YouTube channel, and on my Telegram channel. It's the mother of all talk shows, and that's why you're encouraged to speak back to the teachers. Let me give you the phone numbers with which to do so. If you're in the United Kingdom, it's 08081 965522. And if you're in the United States, it's +1 844 944 3344. It's entirely free, whether you're in the United Kingdom, the United States, or Canada. Why not get dialing now to avoid disappointment? This is the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik.
Peter says the Afghan people have lost, George. I thought you were better than this, to be honest. Give me a call, Peter. Tell me what you mean. And Oliver says, for some reason, George was on the jihadist side when it came to Yugoslavia. And that's the reason I will never trust him. I fought against the war on Yugoslavia with all my breath and all my heart. Me and Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn and others were practically the only people in this country opposing the war on Yugoslavia, the destruction of Yugoslavia. How dare you, you imbecile? If you have any guts, you'll pick up the phone right now and call this show and justify that utter slander. Really. And Yoda says, love the show. Best entertainment and education on the airwaves.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Let's go straight to the maestro, the doyen of psephologists, the man who's forgotten more about elections in Britain than most people will ever know. Professor Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University in my old manor in Glasgow. Professor, thank you for joining us. It's not every day you get the chance to say that somebody's lost a seat they've held for 200 years, is it?
No, it certainly isn't. And the truth is, this is a by-election that the Conservatives should never have been at risk of losing. Yes, of course, governments find life difficult in by-elections. They often suffer quite a substantial swing. And, you know, a 20-point drop in the Conservative vote, you would have said, well, pretty bad, but, you know, not unprecedented. However, what we saw here was a 31-point drop in Conservative support. It's the second biggest drop in a by-election that the party was trying to defend in post-war British politics. And it occurred in a constituency that voted 60% for leave in the EU referendum. It's a very different constituency from Cheshire and Amersham, which Liberal Democrats also won from the Conservatives back in the summer. That was a pro-Remain constituency. It was one where the Conservative vote was already in decline, and where the Liberal Democrats had done rather well in the general election. That was, as it were, an apple ripe to be picked. In contrast, North Shropshire was stony ground for Liberal Democrats. They only managed to come second narrowly once in the course of the last 6 elections. You might well have expected that the Labour Party would have had a go at it, but they decided to leave it to the Liberal Democrats. And the Liberal Democrats took that opportunity, frankly, with quite amazing success.
Now, how do you account for it? It can't be Brexit, because the constituency was overwhelmingly Brexit. So what was it?
Well, the most immediate and proximate explanation is undoubtedly the Prime Minister's difficulties of the last 6 weeks. The national opinion polls have told us that in the wake of the Owen Paterson affair, of course, an affair that led directly to this by-election, but secondly, the video that was released of the mock press conference in which reference was made in a somewhat nervous, giggling fashion to an alleged party/gathering on the 18th of December last year in contravention of the lockdown restrictions and various other stories since about that. In the wake of which it's quite clear the public do not believe, 2/3 of them, that the Prime Minister's been telling the truth. His personal ratings have fallen quite substantially, and support for the Conservatives has literally fallen by 6 points in 6 weeks. That's quite a substantial and speedy drop by the normal rhythm of opinion polls. So it was already clear that there was quite a substantial body of disaffection including many people who voted Conservative in 2019. And in the context of a by-election, when there was a party pitching for the protest vote, then the government was potentially vulnerable. And in a sense, I think one of the important things, therefore, about this by-election is I think this is the first by-election at which we can say that the Liberal Democrats regained the role of the classic party of by-election protest at times of Conservative difficulty. That was a role they performed readily and often before 2010, when, of course, they entered into coalition with the Conservatives in government. Since then, the only by-elections they've won have either been constituencies that voted Remain, like Richmond out just in London, or Chesham and Amersham just outside, or in Brecon there was a bit of a deal with Plaid Cymru. Now we see the Liberal Democrats doing well in a pro-Brexit constituency, but just picking up the protest vote. A protest vote that in part comes from people who would otherwise have voted Conservative. That's the foundation of it. But then also managing to persuade people who would otherwise vote Labour to vote for them. And I think this also begins to mark the end of the antipathy amongst many Labour voters to the Liberal Democrats because of their involvement in the coalition, an antipathy that has meant that Labour voters have perhaps been less willing to switch to the Liberal Democrats tactically than they were in the past. Perhaps now that era has been forgotten so far as Labour voters are concerned. So that's all the most immediate proximate stuff. Now, we should remember, however, that support for the Conservatives has indeed been falling even before the Owen Paterson affair. And to that extent, at least, this is also part of a longer story whereby the fact that the Conservatives have had to increase taxes, or at least they're going to have to increase taxes in order to fund the health service and social care, that's some Conservative voters are not too happy about. Of course, there were the problems with shortages of lorry drivers, shortages in the supermarkets, etc. That also has helped to erode the Conservatives' perceptions for competence. So put all this together, and a government which had seemed relatively self-assured against a pretty weak opposition, all of a sudden has lost that assuredness of foot, and indeed has just simply the combination of circumstance and self-inflicted damage now sees it, as much as 12, 13 points adrift of the tally it had just 2 years ago.
And how much of all of that could be positively affected by a change of leader?
Well, let's break it down into the two parts. There's the circumstances and there are the self-inflicted wounds. The self-inflicted wounds are undoubtedly largely Boris Johnson's responsibility. It was Boris Johnson who tried to get his troops to overturn the proposed suspension for Owen Paterson, only eventually having to climb down because of the adverse reaction. And it's Boris Johnson who has been trying to say to people the rules were not broken a year ago, there wasn't a party, statements that he frankly has not been able to persuade large sections of the public to believe. Now, both these incidents are perhaps indicative of a wider criticism or characteristic of the Prime Minister. This is a Prime Minister who is focused on trying to get what he wants done, and is relatively unconcerned about the process by which he gets there. This, after all, is a Prime Minister that back in September 2019 was told by the Supreme Court that he had broken the law in trying to prorogate Parliament and therefore stop it from meeting as part of his attempt to try and drive Brexit through. Now, on that occasion, he didn't suffer a serious adverse public reaction because at least half the public were in favour of his objective, which was trying to pursue Brexit. The reason why the Prime Minister's style has now been his undoing is that he's still tried to pursue that style for two things that nobody else believes in. One, there isn't a public out there who thinks that it's a good idea that MPs' lives should be made easier and that they should be allowed to take money in order to lobby ministers. Nobody thinks that's a good idea, so therefore people object to the attempt to try and avoid Owen Paterson's suspension. And there certainly isn't a constituency out there of voters who think, well, yes, of course, we have to keep to the rules on lockdown, but it's absolutely fine if people in and around 10 Downing Street don't. We know that from the Dominic Cummings affair, that people think very badly of those close to the Prime Minister seemingly ignoring the strict lockdown rules. So at this point, the Prime Minister's style becomes his undoing. Now, whether or not Boris Johnson can change his style, well, who knows? It will require a change, but changing the leader would certainly perhaps mean we had somebody who was less likely to make that kind of mistake. But that still doesn't leave the other problems the Conservatives face. They are faced the fact that they're still having to manage a pandemic, a very difficult pandemic. Of course, it's resurged, and the government faces some very difficult choices. And of course, we are talking about a Prime Minister and a party that is frankly deeply reluctant to go back to much in the way of restrictions. We saw the difficulty that was last week just simply introducing some relatively modest measures. 100 Tory MPs reject. The London stance is very different from that in Edinburgh and Cardiff and Belfast, all of which have tighter measures and all of which frankly wish to impose tougher measures, but are limited at the moment by the fact that the UK government wouldn't be willing to fund these tougher measures. Now, the pandemic isn't going to go away. Making those difficulties and dealing with it is something that this government is going to have to deal with, irrespective of who's Prime Minister, and it may have to make decisions that is not in accordance with its instinct. The other thing, of course, is that the pandemic has resulted in this government planning for levels of public expenditure and taxation which are in both cases, either the highest in 50 years or in one case pretty much the highest since the 1950s. This is not a comfortable position for many Conservatives to be in. But again, whatever were Boris Johnson's instincts, and it's not entirely clear that Boris Johnson is a small state politician, but the truth is just trying to deal with the legacy of the pandemic has, in a sense, again, forced the Conservatives into a position which many of them find uncomfortable. And whoever were to succeed Boris Johnson will still have to deal with exactly those same realities that Conservatives struggle to deal with.
Now, you mentioned the C word, Cummings. To what extent have things begun to rattle down for Boris Johnson since he parted company with his Svengali? Maybe the Prime Minister's brain is missing.
Well, first of all, remember that it was Dominic Cummings' famous trip to Durham and then to Barnard Castle that first did serious electoral damage to the Conservatives. Before that trip, they were running at about 50% in the polls because everybody was hoping that they were going to solve the pandemic. That balloon got punctured in the wake of Dominic Cummings and they never recovered from that. But actually, remember that not long after Dominic Cummings left Downing Street, the Conservatives' position, which at that stage was around 50-50 with Labour in the polls, improved quite considerably because, of course, of the vaccine rollout. There is no doubt that the vaccine rollout is the one element of the pandemic that the Conservatives have persuaded people is A, a success, and B, a success for which they are entitled to take the credit. And of course, they also argue that they were able to achieve this because we weren't inside the European Union. Now, that's a position we can argue about, but that's the claim they make, and it's a claim that they've sold very successfully. So actually, during the spring, summer of this year, Conservatives quite clear lead in the opinion polls. No Dominic Cummings around. It's only more recently that the ship of state in 10 Downing Street has proved to be rather more difficult. Now, it's certainly true, and frankly, I don't know these characters in 10 Downing Street any better than anybody else. One is told that the people who are now in 10 Downing Street are perhaps both amongst officials and amongst special advisors, are perhaps somewhat short on the kind of experience that might be needed to deal with the Prime Minister's office in a time of crisis and difficulty. Well, I'll leave that to rest. I simply report what we are told, but clearly it's certainly not been a happy ship at 10 Downing Street, and it's certainly not one that has dealt with recent affairs with acute political intelligence.
Now, as Macmillan taught us, it's never one damn thing, but one damn thing after another. And no sooner was North Shropshire and its message delivered across the face of the Prime Minister, one of his key cabinet ministers, Lord Frost, walked out the door. How much is that going to damage him?
Well, I think the Lord Frost story kind of takes us back to the fact that Boris Johnson's initial problem during the last 6 weeks was not so much with the electorate, although the electorate, as already said, have had their negatives about him, but actually losing a lot of the trust of his parliamentary party. The Owen Paterson affair, in which he marched his troops into the lobby, only then to do a U-turn 24 hours later, did an awful lot of damage to many Tory MPs' confidence and trust in the Prime Minister's ability to do the job effectively. And since then, we're almost perhaps beginning to see that old fissure inside the Conservative Party that Boris had managed to end, that fissure between the libertarian, Brexit-inclined end of the party and the more centrist end of the party that's decided to swallow Brexit but was never keen on it, that fissure may be opening up again. Because, of course, many of those who have been sceptical about the lockdown measures, really from during the course of the last 12 months, have come disproportionately from those who made Theresa May's life pretty much a misery over Brexit. And Lord Frost is undoubtedly somebody who's part of that number. He's clearly somebody who is very keen on Brexit. The fact that we have a Brexit which minimises the extent to which the UK is obliged to follow EU regulations is entirely the product of Lord Frost's vision. He is also a small state conservative. He's amongst those Brexiteers who was hoping that Brexit was going to lead to smaller government, less regulation, and he's also instinctively against lockdown. And certainly that this incident is together with the vote last Tuesday, is perhaps an indication as to how Boris Johnson is now at risk of seeing his premiership beginning to be run ragged by internal divisions within the Conservative Party. And indeed, on Tuesday, the only way he could get his vote through was off the back of Labour votes. Now, it's his good fortune at the moment. The Labour Party are willing to back him over coronavirus in the way the Labour Party weren't willing to back Theresa May over Brexit. So therefore, the rebellions meant she couldn't get her Brexit deal through. But of course, one of the fascinating things, again, that we're now looking at is what's the Labour Party going to say about coronavirus in the coming days and weeks. At the moment, they're still standing back from actually saying, we think the government should introduce more measures, but maybe they will. And then the question is, well, if Boris Johnson doesn't follow them, does he then lose the confidence of the Labour Party in the handling of the pandemic? Because at the moment, that's not something that the Prime Minister can afford. But of course, equally, he finds himself caught in a rock between a hard place. He can't afford to upset his own party much anymore.
And then a Tory MP for Bridgend drives his car into a lamppost and fails the breathalyzer. Breaking news. Another by-election, perhaps, Sir John. We'll have to wait and see.
We'll have to wait and see. It depends, of course, whether it becomes a custodial offence or not, or whether, I mean, there's got to be a reason as to why the by-election is triggered, and that would normally require him, there being some kind of custodial offence. So we will have to see whether that's the case. Of course, in the meantime, the other thing which is true is that Liz Truss has been put in charge of the negotiations that Lord Frost has vacated, so evidently nobody knew he was going to be added to cabinet. So that means that Liz Truss is now not only Foreign Secretary and Equalities Minister, but has now got to try and extract the government from the weeds of the Northern Irish Protocol, a protocol, of course, to which the Prime Minister agreed in the first place, but which so far at least the UK government has not been able to negotiate the deal in a way that either with which it's happy, or indeed many people in Northern Ireland are happy.
Well, she's been set up to fail on that, isn't she? I mean, Boris doesn't like that she's been on manoeuvres, literally on top of a tank, imitating Mrs. Thatcher. And now she's got to go and defend a position which I think in their heart the Tories have already sold.
Well, you may be right. That could well be the Machiavellian position that the Prime Minister is going on. The other hand, of course, She is a bit of a convert to Brexit. I mean, she was very keen on negotiating free trade deals when she was Secretary of State for the Department of Trade. And indeed, I think it's her performance in that role that helped persuade the Prime Minister that she should replace Dominic Raab as Foreign Secretary, a role in which Dominic Raab didn't always seem to be entirely happy. So, you may be right, George. The alternative interpretation is that perhaps he's decided that he needs a safe pair of hands, but a pair of hands that perhaps might be somewhat more willing to do his bidding than perhaps in the end Lord Frost was willing to do. Lord Frost, at the end of the day, very clearly had his own agenda over Brexit, an agenda that perhaps the Prime Minister was happy to allow him to pursue for a long time, but not when it began to cut across other decisions that the Prime Minister felt was essential for his government.
Professor Sir John Curtice, as always, a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Let me have your calls, by the way, on that. Controversial stuff all round. But here's the first question of the night. On this day in 1984, my goodness, that long ago, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher signed a declaration to return Hong Kong to China. Who'd have thunk it? The last governor was Chris Patten. What was his nickname in China? A, Mr. Blobby, B, Fat Pang, C, Bunter, or all three? Answer after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Of all talk shows. Join our faculty of legends, contributors, and callers. Everyone is welcome.
The answer is that Chris Patten, who could have been called any one of or all three of Mr. Blobby, Fat Pang, or Bunter, was in fact known in China as Fat Pang. As well he might. I've known him for half a century, and he's always been Fat Pang to me. Now, Li Jing Jing is a Chinese journalist and broadcaster who was a very great hit the last time she was on here, and we've brought her back to discuss one or two matters of pressing concern to the world about her country of China. Li, thank you very much for joining us again at this early hour for you. But let me ask you about Chris Patten, first of all, because it will have come as some kind of surprise to many viewers and listeners that it was Margaret Thatcher that signed the deal to return Hong Kong to China. It was egregiously taken from China, of course, in an unequal treaty, but with a time limit. That time limit ran out. Mrs. Thatcher agreed to hand over, but the British have never really accepted that they were handing Hong Kong back to China. And that may be the origin of some of the other issues that we're going to talk about tonight. Am I right?
Yes. You know what, George? But first, thanks for having me back to your show.
Welcome.
Always a pleasure to be here with you. And you know what? probably have some connection issues. There's no image of me. Let me调整一下画面。
Well, we definitely need an image of you. We can hear you, so keep talking, and we'll get the image
cool.
back.
So, you know what? Like, I studied in the UK. And I studied journalism in the UK. And it's always funny to me. That whenever during the July the 1st, the return date, the day that Hong Kong returned to the mainland, I can always see, like on the BBC, The Guardian, I never see the celebration, like how happy Chinese are during this day. I mean, it's a big contradictions. When the day, biggest celebration, and you see how happy Chinese are, how happy many people in Hong Kong are, and we have big ceremonies. And then when I turn to BBC and Guardian, it's always how sad, how depressed, how oppressed people are. It's so bizarre to me. But then like, so that's probably the first hit I realized, okay, there's a big contradictions of big misunderstandings about this return of Hong Kong. But yeah, okay, so, and even this frustration for many people in Britain probably still lasts to today, because just a few days ago, yesterday, I saw a clip from BBC, I think. One of the experts was talking about, because now China finally have no foreign interferences, they can elect the government officials by themselves. And then the experts say, well, you know what, now basically Hong Kong is going back to the colonial period, except the governor is appointed by Beijing instead of London. It's totally outrageous.
It is. But what is worse is not being able to see you. So we're going to get you back within 60 seconds or so. Let me read some social. Jonathan Wood says, all COVID-19 is serious. Another surge, whether or not less virulent, is a concern and needs to be taken seriously. I trust what I hear from doctors and NHS staff, yet I think governments are manipulating it for their purposes. And Jamie Jack says, I went with exaggerated. You have one side saying there is no evidence the Omicron is less severe than Delta. Then the other side, where it was first discovered, claiming it is less severe. Honestly, no wonder people are confused with conflicting claims flying around. And Georgie Harrison says, all I know is I was unable to see my dying mother for over 6 weeks as visiting was limited, then stopped due to other people not taking COVID seriously. I saw her in her casket the other week and we laid her to rest on Thursday. I have taken COVID seriously and continue to do so. Amen. And my sincere condolences, Georgie. Chris Torfain, who is in China, says it's a bit too binary, GG. Basically, I think the UK MSM are producing COVID porn on this issue, whilst the UK government, as usual, have not taken the latest variant seriously, particularly given some major failure in the vaccine rollout, i.e., it doesn't prevent infection. I don't know that it ever promised to prevent infection. I certainly never imagined it as preventing infection. I got my vaccination because I believed and continue to believe that if I do get infected, I'm less likely to die from it if I have been vaccinated. That's a different thing, Chris, to that. Now, Li Jing Jing is back with us in all her glory. Yes, she is. On that point, Li, now, again, coming down the road from Scotland today, I was listening to the BBC talking about the Hong Kong elections. And every bulletin, everyone, stressed the fact that only those loyal to Beijing are able to participate as candidates in the Hong Kong elections. And in the end, I was shouting at the radio in the car, because I don't know if you yourself are fully aware of this, but as a member of parliament for almost 30 years, I had to pledge allegiance after every single election with my hand on a Bible. I had to pledge allegiance to Her Majesty the Queen and all of her heirs and successors, whoever they were, whether good or bad. I had to pledge allegiance, or I would not have been allowed to sit down in my chair in the House of Commons. In fact, I wouldn't even have been allowed to be paid. I wouldn't have got my salary. Even though I was elected by the people, I had to pledge my allegiance to the British Crown before I could sit in the Parliament. Give me, if you would, any major differences between what I've just described as the British system and what China and Hong Kong now have in terms of theirs.
Thank you so much for pointing that out. Exactly. I think for every country, all the government officials, they have to pledge allegiance to their respective officials. So why is suddenly a problem when Hong Kong, China's territory, are requiring the same thing, patriots governing their own territory, is a problem for many people in Britain and in America. It's so double standard and so hypocritical. So, and also, countries like the US or the UK keep criticizing China over the Hong Kong issue about democracy, where in the first place, Britain never gave Hong Kong democracy. Chris Patten was appointed by the UK back then. So if you've never given people the democracy that you've been praying all this time, so why you're making a fuss about Hong Kong now?
Indeed so. Now, on the subject of double standards, the Grand Prix successfully took place in Saudi Arabia the other week, even though there was blood on the tracks. But the Winter Olympics are now the subject of a boycott, at least on the political level. Have you gotten over yet the dreadful news that you will not be visited by Joe Biden as an official visitor at the Winter Olympics?
Yeah, too bad. Politicians won't come to the Winter Olympic Games because Olympic is a game all about politicians participating, right? I mean, who really cares about whether politicians are coming to this event, especially during this COVID period? But okay, so about this boycott, I think, first, it's not an athletic boycott. It's not a commercial boycott. It's a diplomatic boycott, which basically just means they don't send politicians to come here, but it doesn't have any impact on athletes participating, and also won't impact on the broadcasting on televisions, or doesn't have any impact on the commercial sponsors. So basically, it's a non-story, I think particularly in the sporting circle. But so it doesn't affect China here. It doesn't affect the Winter Olympic Games. It definitely will happen, and a lot of people are waiting for this big moment. But I think this is maybe for Biden, it's more like sending a message domestically, because he has to act tough towards this China, this foreign enemy, right? To keep his butt in the chair in the White House for a longer time. He has to act tough. And that's for him domestically. And fourth, I think secondly, probably this is a chance for them to keep pushing their anti-China propaganda. By that, I mean the human rights abuse allegations, totally false, and the so-called genocide. I think the White House press secretary, Jen Psaki, said they won't send any diplomats to Beijing because given the PRC's ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang and other human rights abuses, which are completely groundless, I have to say. For example, like last time I was on your show, George, I mentioned some of the facts. I can briefly mention again, because the genocide were totally just false allegations because first, the Uyghur population is growing much faster than any other ethnic groups, not just in Xinjiang, in all China. And the populations of Uyghurs grew from 3.6 million in 1953 to 11.6 million to 2020. So in the past 67 years, the population of Uyghurs grew by 8 million. And second, Uyghurs got many favorable policies in terms of being enrolled in universities and got hired by government departments or companies. For example, if you are a Uyghur, you get a lot more scores in your college entrance exams. So that's basically to help Uyghurs to get higher education. And third, the forced labor and also the one-child policy. I forgot to mention that. All ethnic groups were exempted from the one-child policy when the policy was only recently being abolished because the general declining birth rate. But when Han people could only have one child, Uyghurs can have 3 or 4 or multiple kids. So that 3 basically says that's no genocide is going on. But we have to see where all these allegations about this so-called human rights abuses come from. Basically, either it's about genocide or forced labor or sterilization towards Uyghur women. All these atrocities, allegations come from the one think tank called ASPI in Australia. It's called Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And all this so-called China expert who have never came to China before, conducted all this research on their keyboard, twisting, abusing all these government papers and the data, and making all these allegations. And their research were amplified by all this big corporate media. But this think tank, why is this think tank doing this? If you look at the sponsors, you will find out their sponsors include multiple governments. Australian governments, US government, British government, Japanese government, and also the US Defense Department, Australian Defense Department. So this think tank is basically sponsored by several governments, all these governments that were really trying hard to contain China, and also the military-industrial complex. So you know what they are doing, why they are making these allegations.
Quite so.
And they give this. Yeah.
And these people don't like Muslims very much, and they don't like the Chinese very much, but they absolutely love Chinese Muslims. If you believe that, I've got a bridge in London I can sell you. Just quickly, the Chinese tennis player who was the original cause célèbre in the run-up to the Olympic Games, they've dropped that now because she's alive and well and playing tennis.
Exactly. That's just another excuse that all this media or these government officials, they were already pushing this boycott even before the tennis players thing happened. And now it's funny to see what they are so passionate about, treating this event as like last straw. Oh, see, that's what they're doing to their athletes. And they keep asking for, show me the images of her. We don't see images for where is she? And then the image of her pops up and so, no, that's just image. It could be an old image. Let me see a video of her. And the video pops up. She's having dinner with her friends, talking, and so, no, but she's not doing tennis-related stuff.
And then they dropped it altogether. Lee, it's been wonderful to see you again. I hope it's not long before we see you again. I've got to take a break now for the news. But in the second hour, it's Blue Hawaii or Hawaii 5-0 or any other Hawaiian cliche you can think of. But first, it's the news with Jamie Lowe.
Radio Sputnik News.
The UK Health Secretary Shadia Edwards-Dashti has refused to rule out plans for a 2-week circuit breaker lockdown after Christmas, as he accused those unwilling to have the COVID vaccine of having a damaging impact on society. When pushed on reports that ministers are drawing up plans to introduce more restrictions after Christmas, he said that the government will do what is necessary, but that any change must be backed up by the data. He also confirmed that Parliament would be recalled if the government believed introducing further restrictions was necessary. Professor Sir Mark Woolport, a member of the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, or SAGE, asked if the data suggests further restrictions are needed right now. In a word, he said yes. He said infections are rising fast and there needs to be time allowed for recently administered vaccines and boosters to take effect. Senior government scientists have also said that extra restrictions are needed within days to prevent hospitals from being overwhelmed by Omicron. Possible tougher measures could be imposed after Boxing Day, according to reports, although a contingency plan has not yet been presented to ministers. Experts who produce advice for ministers believe there are now hundreds of thousands of infections every day, many more than the number of official cases recorded on the daily dashboard. Senior officials in Scotland have also suggested that the country could face tougher COVID-19 restrictions around New Year. Clinical Director Professor Jason Leach said it was better to act harder and early, while Scotland Office Minister Ian Stewart said big decisions may need to be made. A Four Nations Cobra meeting is being held today following calls for more financial support for businesses. However, Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has said she has no plans to recall Holyrood to discuss further measures. British businesses have reacted with dismay at possible tougher COVID measures before Christmas after the Health Secretary said they could not be ruled out. Kate Nichols, Chief Executive of UK Hospitality, which represents many restaurants, hotels and leisure firms, said further restrictions would be devastating for the industry. It's better to trade even a little bit than be closed down altogether, she said. There are a lot of costs closing down sites and then reopening them. Having a fourth lockdown would be the final nail in the coffin for some businesses. Germany has become the latest European country to ban most travellers from Britain to try and slow the spread of the Omicron variant. German nationals and residents will still be allowed to enter from the UK. The measures will take effect from this evening. France has already introduced similar curbs as coronavirus infections surge in Britain. The Netherlands has entered into a tough lockdown to curb the spread of Omicron, with non-essential shops, bars, restaurants and other public places to close. Schools will also shut from Monday and the lockdown will run until at least the 14th of January, Prime Minister Mark Rutte announced. Piers Corbyn, the brother of former Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn, has been arrested on suspicion of encouraging people to attack MPs' offices. He was arrested in South London early this morning. The Metropolitan Police said the arrest related to a video filmed during a rally in London against COVID restrictions. The video shared on social media on Saturday evening appears to show the 74-year-old prominent anti-vaccination campaigner criticising MPs who supported the introduction of Plan B measures. After decrying those scum who have decided to go ahead with introducing new fascism, he tells a crowd to find out if their MPs have supported the new restrictions. The United States Senator Joe Manchin, a Democrat, has said that he cannot support President Joe Biden's sweeping social, climate and spending bill, striking a defensive blow to the Democrats' agenda. He said bluntly it's a no on the $1.7 trillion package in an interview on Fox News Sunday. If I can't go home and explain to the people of West Virginia, I can't vote for it, and I cannot vote to continue with this piece of legislation. I just can't. I've tried everything humanly possible, and I can't get there, Manchin said. In announcing his opposition, Manchin raised the same concerns about the bill that he's had all along: inflation, rising debt, and a mismatch between the package's 10-year funding and its shorter-term programs. With an evenly split Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer needs every Democrat to go along with the legislation, which only requires a simple majority vote. That gives Manchin enormous leverage over Biden's agenda, allowing him to single-handedly sink a priority that Democrats have spent much of the year working on. More than 100 people are now thought to have died after a devastating storm struck the Philippines on Thursday. Super Typhoon Rai, with winds of about 195 kilometres per hour, sent some 300,000 people running for safety when it hit the country's southeastern islands. Rescue teams have described scenes of complete carnage. Establishing the scale of the losses has proved difficult as communication to a number of areas has been cut off. At least 120 deaths have been reported, according to AFP news agency, with fierce landslides and flooding may have claimed many more. And finally, the number of people choosing to play as Wrexham AFC in the popular computer game Football Manager has surged since the club's Hollywood takeover. The National League club's profile has risen massively since actors Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney bought it in February. More than 5,000 people are currently playing as Wrexham in the game since its latest version was released last month, about a 200% rise. In the real world yesterday, rather than the virtual one, Wrexham won 5-0 against Gloucester City in the third round of the FA Cup. And that's the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway, only on Sputnik Radio.
Well, the poll is actually quite overwhelming. Most people, 88% of respondents, believe that Omicron is being exaggerated. That's on my Twitter feed. On my YouTube, it's 80% think it's exaggerated. But on Telegram, it's 87% think that it's being exaggerated. Thousands of you have voted already. You've got about an hour or 45, 50 minutes or so to vote. You can vote on my Twitter feed, on my YouTube channel, and on my Telegram channel. And there's a huge response on social media. Christine Watson says it seems that Boris is doing a Theresa May on Brexit, i.e. no change. Boris is not interested, does not care, and possibly welcomes EU dominance. Well, don't forget that on the eve of the Brexit campaign kicking off, Boris Johnson wrote 2 columns for the Daily Telegraph, one arguing for Remain and one arguing for Brexit. And he only decided, literally, at the last moment, to publish the one supporting Brexit. Billy G says, down under here, the media never lets up on anti-China news. And the Bolshevik beekeeper, is there a better name on social media than the Bolshevik beekeeper? Says, today is my first day out of isolation after recently testing positive for COVID. Chest still rattly, but taste and smell have returned. I'm unvaccinated and intend to remain so. The scaremongering and vaccine pressure is to be resisted. And Dave Walker says, packed pub last night, negative today. I'm boosted as well. I prefer to take my chances in life. My choice, it completely unfazes me and those close to me. My mum is nearly 70 and also wishes to crack on with life. If you don't like it, lock yourself in a cupboard. And John Speck says, we in South Africa have no lockdowns during this period, and we have had the Omicron basically first. Sounds pretty ridiculous, the lengths that some countries are going to. And Dave Hill says, sadly, Labour are now the non-opposition party, due to ignoring its voters during Brexit and more recently backing disproportionate government COVID measures. So sad. So sad was 80 years ago the Japanese fascist attack on the people of Hawaii at Pearl Harbor, which caused great loss of life and great material damage to the United States Armed Forces. It had the paradoxical effect of bringing the United States into the war. They might never have joined the war. They might have watched it on newsreel, as they had been doing up until that point. But it did indeed bring the United States into the war, and that was a very significant turning point indeed. Most people's knowledge of Hawaii, apart from having a kind of fitful wish to go and visit it sometime, it definitely looks like a Pacific paradise. We've seen Hawaii 5-0. Those of us of a certain age watched Elvis in Blue Hawaii, a very fine album and a very fine movie. But that's probably as much knowledge as most people have got about Hawaii, at least on this side of the ocean. It came as a surprise to me then when seeking to talk to someone about the 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, I discovered that actually things are not going well between the colonizing power, I think we have to call them that, of the United States of America and the native people of Hawaii. The man I spoke to was Kaniela Ing, who is a former Hawaii state representative, and I've persuaded him to come and give you the benefit of the wisdom he's already given me. Kaniela, welcome to the mother of all talk shows. Wonderful to see you again, looking wonderful. Let's dispense first with the very auspicious and somber anniversary that the 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor and the attack on it more particularly meant to the people of the island. Was it much commemorated? What was the form, shape of the commemoration?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for having me. Good to see you again. And yeah, we say we'll never forget the attacks on Pearl Harbor. It does show that we're not all safer when you're an occupied nation. You said colonize. A lot of Native Hawaiians consider our nation still existing but occupied because, in fact, the United States recognized in 1992 that the overthrow of our government was illegal and illegitimate. There was a resolution that Bill Clinton signed that said so, but of course, there's nothing that they did in restitution in order to, give any teeth to that resolution. But they did recognize. So, if it's not actually colonized, it's occupied. And we've seen time and time again that we're not all safer because of it. And sometimes we can even be worse off. The most 3 polluted spots in Hawaii are on or adjacent to military bases. We call them EPA Superfund sites here, Environmental Protection Agency. And most recently, they poisoned our water source here with petroleum, jet fuel. It's well,
I wanted to talk to you about that, but just before we come on to it, how overbearing, how large is the U.S. military presence in Hawaii, and is there any other U.S. presence other than military? Is there a big U.S. civil society program in Hawaii, for example?
Well, 1/3. So the majority of the population of Hawaii is on one island, Oahu. About 90% of our population is on this island. And of that island, 1/3 of the land is controlled by the federal government of the United States. 22% of the island is controlled by the military. So we're really reliant on the jobs and the economy, but that's on purpose. And if you actually break it down, like where are these jobs going? Can civilians even apply for them? Are they good enough jobs where you only need one job to survive? Generally, the answer is no. And these are government jobs, meaning that if we just diverted those funds, so instead of paying to build weapons and, our livelihoods depend on the death and destruction of others abroad, if we just diverted those funds to create jobs for our own human needs, we'd all be much, much better off. So there's idea that but we rely on military. And from a lot of us in the Native community and the environmental justice community, that therein lies the problem. That reliance is actually the issue.
And how are relations between the occupying military forces and the local people?
Well, over time, you know, we're in an American education system. We're in an American value system. So we were taught from very early that we are much better off when they're there. So a lot of the older generations are staunch defenders of the military presence, but a lot of the younger folks and Native Hawaiians in particular, and immigrants who are displaced from their own land who are now here because of the U.S. military have a different perspective. So you're seeing that sort of alternative, more accurate view rise up as time goes by.
Now tell us about this water pollution. This is a story so extraordinary. Tell us what happened.
Right. So this connects to Pearl Harbor. So when we were attacked by Japan, the U.S. decided to house a lot of kind of up their presence here. So they had a lot of jets flying in and out. I mean, that was the strategy of being in Hawaii in the first place, of having that jump off point in the Pacific. So they needed fuel. So what they did is they buried massive tanks under hills, right above our water source, right above the aquifer. So the reason why these gas tanks were there is for this ancient war that no longer exists. So there's no reason to still have these gas tanks still above our aquifer, and it's been slowly leaking out. They've been concealing that fact for a long time, and kind of the long-term impacts and the chronic impacts. But recently, it sort of bursted open. It's really only this thick, the tank, like about an inch thick. So it leaked into our aquifers. We saw petroleum in the water fountains at elementary schools. We've seen babies from military families being rushed to the hospital. Nearly 3,000 military families have evacuated their own homes for Christmas. And it's really sad. And you're seeing the Navy actually covering it up, kind of saying it's worse, not as bad as it is. But, the people know better. The State Department of Health is at odds right now with the military. So it's a real crisis, but the people are rising up. The people are standing up. And this is a rare opportunity where you see folks that identify as pro-military and conservative standing with folks who've been, asking them to leave for a long time.
And what scale is that on now? And are the U.S. government taking it seriously?
The scale, it's hard to tell because, they're trying to obscure facts and minimize the impact or minimize the perception of the impact. But, there's at least 60 to 80,000 residents that are being impacted. And I don't know, like in my community, which isn't even really close to the source, restaurants are being precautionary and they're serving bottled water for free instead of tap water. And you can kind of see it. Like when you pour a glass of water, you can see there's something off. They're purposely trying to not avail the data. It doesn't look like they're taking any real action. Native Hawaiian leaders, environmental leaders have written to the president, making sure that he's aware. We heard back that, he's aware, but we haven't seen any action so far. It's like civilian control of democracy is supposed to be a tenet of American democracy. Like that's part of the American promise. But this is just yet another example of fascist hypocrisy.
The American dream. Problem is you've got to be asleep to believe it. Kaniela Ing, thanks very much. I wish you a speedy return to the Hawaiian Legislative Assembly. I'm sure that you will sometime soon. Now, do I have another question? This is the week in 1940 that the Christmas classic film It's a Wonderful Life was released. I was trying very hard to persuade my family last evening to watch it, but to no avail. What was the name of the angel in the film? A. Clarence. B. Hubert. C. Francis. Answer after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
Here? Where am I?
Welcome to St. Peter's Gate, my son.
Is this one of that Hillary's tricks, that devil?
Be still, my son. The Clintons cannot hurt you here. You are safe with me in heaven.
Oh, heck. Knew I shouldn't have taken Bob's homemade vaccine. Oh, Lord have mercy, I am not worthy.
Before you pass on, you may ask any question you desire.
Anything?
With my omniscient knowledge, I can tell you anything you wish to know.
Well, Lord, you gotta tell me. All-powerful creator of this universe, before you judge me, I've been searching for answers my whole life.
Yes, my child.
I have to know, who shot JFK?
Another one. It was a lone gunman by the name of Lee Harvey Oswald. He was not a government agent, and there was no second shooter on that grassy knoll in Dallas.
My God, this goes higher up than we thought.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The angel in the film It's a Wonderful Life was, of course, called Clarence. As I say, I was agitating to watch it last night. I didn't get my way. We had to watch Home Alone 2 instead for the 200th time. But it's on Christmas Eve. We know that because, hey, it's always on Christmas Eve. Now, one of the great success stories of 2021 has been the launch of this show's podcast, the Moats podcast. And the young man who does it all and who has been breaking all kinds of records, hopefully through the glass, will be able to tell me the latest. Save me reading it out on a piece of paper. Simon, how has it been this week?
Well, George, just like the Conservative Party at Christmas, the party never stops with the podcast. It's another week, another record broken. May I remind our listeners that last week was our biggest ever week. We had numbers putting us in the upper echelons of charts in up to 21 countries. Yet this week, we've gone up another 16%.
Oh.
Not only that, but our daily record has been broken, and then 2 days later, it was broken again. You may remember a few weeks ago, George, we celebrated our 100th country of listeners. Well, I'm very pleased to tell you now that that number is sitting at 108.
Wow.
We've had joining us this week Aruba, Eswatini, Guatemala, Guinea and South Sudan are joining the Open University of the airwaves. Absolutely fantastic.
That's fantastic news.
Now, here's a fun stat for you. We are currently listened to in 46 states in the USA, with folks in California listening to us the most. But a call to arms of the people of North Dakota, Mississippi, West Virginia, Vermont and Alaska, please. I also have
don't let that one go by. So there's 4 states in the USA that are not yet listening to the podcast.
Yes, so that was North
Let's
Dakota.
slowly go through them.
So North Dakota.
North Dakota. Do you know anybody in North Dakota? If you do, tell them to download the podcast. Next.
That's Mississippi as well, joining us.
MISSISSIPPI. How can you possibly not be listening to the Moats podcast? If you know anybody in the great state of Mississippi, please tell them. We want their name up in lights next week. Third.
West Virginia.
West Virginia. There's a song, isn't there?
I'm sure there is, yeah. There's quite a few.
John Denver.
And Vermont as well. Please join us, Vermont.
Vermont?
Yes, please.
My wife went to university there.
Well, she needs to
I thought they were intellectuals, eggheads there. How could Vermont not yet be listening to the Moats podcast? Please, if you know anybody in Vermont, let them know that their state is letting the USA down. Anything else to report, Simon?
Quite a few things to report, George. As I said, up to 21 countries charting last week. This week, just 26. That is Great Britain, Canada, Australia, France, 2 charts in Sweden, Ireland, Japan, South America, South Africa, most countries in South America. South Africa, Hong Kong, Jing Jing's just been with us. I have a review from Hong Kong, I'll just read you out. A new country that's joined us, our friends in Argentina have put us in the top 20 this week. Our friends in Singapore,
don't cry
top
for me,
50.
Argentina.
Folks in Thailand enjoying their moonlight parties while listening to the mother of all talk shows. Slovakia, Nigeria, Iceland, a population of 350,000. However, we are the 3rd most listened to podcast in that country. Pakistan, Egypt, Zimbabwe. Now, Zimbabwe, I have to tell you, George, we were the #1 political podcast in Zimbabwe this week.
We're top of the pops in Zimbabwe.
And joining us as well is Oman. Now, you may notice, folks, if you're listening to our podcast, whether that's on Apple Podcasts, Deezer, Spotify, Acast, we're on hundreds of platforms all over the world. But what you can do is send us reviews. We have episodes of the Short Highlights programme, which is an hour and a half. We also have our bonus episode where we select our favourite interview from the week and release it on a Thursday. Some viewers or listeners may notice that Jing Jing has shown up before, one of our most listened to bonus episodes.
She's very popular, yeah.
Not only are we doing well in Hong Kong,
in China.
Oh, there certainly is, yes, and I hope more and more of them will be listening. But some of them have sent us a review, and I'll just read it to you here, George. The Mother of All Talk Shows podcast, 5 stars, a breath of fresh air. This podcast provides honest and truthful reports on a range of geopolitical issues and domestic topics. Great listening, George, from Hong Kong, which, despite Western propaganda, is a great place with all the freedoms it has ever had, plus much more, and government policies aimed at benefiting local people, not just for the British colonists. I can put my teeth in.
Colonists.
Right, thank you very much, George. Ripping the wealth out and sending it back home to prop up the UK finances. And it's not the only 5-star review we've had, George, because we're currently ranked right up there, pure 5-star reviews. We've not had anything lower.
And so people do that, whatever platform they take the podcast from, they can put a review on that.
There are absolutely
platform.
Loads of ways that you can leave reviews. If you're on Apple Podcasts, reviews are at the bottom of the page. If you're on Spotify, it's very important that you follow us because it gives you the option to say how much you're enjoying the podcast. And this way, the more reviews, the more people see us and the more people can join the Open University of the Airwaves.
Great job. Thank you very much indeed for that, Simon. And please, any country or territory or state of the Union not yet up in lights, please make sure. Here's the result of the poll. It hasn't changed. Between 80 and 88% of you think the Omicron is being exaggerated. A call. Let's take a call. Is Kenzie there in Glasgow? No. So let me do some more social. John Speck, I've done that one. Dave Hill, I've done that one. Anthony Corkin says, I really don't think most people in the UK give a toss about Hong Kong, China or Taiwan. What people really worry about are issues affecting them closer to home, like rising costs, inept lying politicians, and their health. This story, like so many others, is just background noise to try and deflect attention from people's pressing concerns. And Sister, I'm a Poet, says, okay, pretty, yes, but how about getting someone who doesn't want to suck up to the Chinese government for balance? Well, you're welcome, Sister, I'm a Poet. Here's the number. Are you in the UK, Sister? 08081 965522. Call me now. Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. Kenzie's in Glasgow on Omicron. Let's hear from Kenzie. Go ahead.
Right, George, I'd just like to start with congratulating Ange Postecoglou and Celtic Day for a hard-fought victory at Hampden.
Hail, hail. What was the final score?
2-1 to Celtic. Brilliant.
Excellent. First silverware for Big Ange.
Definitely, and he's already achieved it in 6 months. Took Stevie G 3 years, haha. Anyway.
Go ahead. My goodness.
I know people who've got COVID, and I work in the testing line, and you're getting more positive tests.
Sure.
And I just think, see if a landlord's saying to you, right, you need to, and the government's saying, if you want to go into a venue, you need to have X, Y, and Z, you need to have a pass to prove you've not got a virus. Why is that venue opened in the first place, right? I think the only reason things are still open is people, frankly, trying to profiteer. And the government should maybe step in and help those people. I'm not saying they shouldn't, but I think the only reason a lot of venues are still opening when it's not medically safe is because they're trying to profiteer.
Well, but you were talking about the cup final earlier. Presumably, that was the ground was full of people. So how serious is the Omicron if the football games are still going on?
But people in charge don't care about working class people's lives and would literally that, because they won't shut it down their Christmas. It's economics. They want to make their turn their Christmas in the start of January. Then they'll put us in lockdown for 3-4 months until the summer. Then they'll let people out again to make money, and then they'll put us down into lockdown
but
for
we
Christmas.
can't. We can't survive that way, Kenzie. We can't survive another lockdown.
Well, I just think we should maybe not be putting things open, because I think the longer we stay open, the longer we need to go into lockdown, George. So it's kind of, if you're saying stay open, you're just going to come back to help you. I need to go, mate. I do love the show, and I appreciate your opinions. I do need to boost, mate.
All right, okay. I was going to have a Barney, an up and downer with Kenzie, but he's got to go. Thanks for that. Damien Sullivan says China never bombed Syria or Libya. That's true. And I'm not sure who this one's from. Hello, I'm wondering if I could pose a question to George from Telegram. I live in Australia, so I watch the video on YouTube after the show's finished. My question, you talk about war as if it was imminent. From an Australian point of view, we have announced many new weapons contracts that will not come to reality for 10 to 20 years. I do understand Australia is a small country. It wasn't a small country the last time I looked, that will have little offensive capabilities if war is imminent. I also understand that the purchase of weapons outright, instead of manufactured in Australia, could be the purpose of these contracts, to make money move. The only way I can make sense of the global situation is the need for money to move, to have a perception that the US dollar still has value. The contract announcements allowed the stock market to rise and continue the status quo. I believe we are not at the brink of war, but the brink of economic collapse, which in turn will bring on war. Well, that's very interesting indeed. But I do believe that we're on the brink of war. Possibly not over China, perhaps more likely over the Russian-Ukrainian crisis, or perhaps in the Persian Gulf, perhaps most of all in the Persian Gulf. But any one of those three wars could quickly escalate into being a regional war of great magnitude, involving the use, at least, of tactical and of intermediate range nuclear weapons. And if that doesn't frighten you, well, I don't know what would. Carlos is on the line from Los Angeles. Go ahead, Carlos.
Great to hear from you.
Even better to hear from you. I wish I was in Los Angeles. Go ahead.
Hey, George, I wanted to beg you, with a lot of emphasis, to bring back Dr. Ranjit Brar, because I feel like there's a lot of misinformation, not from social media or anything, but more from mainstream media, that they have been propagating this idea that Omicron is it's the first wave of the virus. So I feel like a professional opinion from Dr. Brar would help clear out any misinformation that has been going on.
Well, he's welcome here anytime. He does have a life and a job as a physician. So we can't keep him on every week forever. But I think I can say that his attitude will be very close to the one I struck. It will be more authoritatively delivered, no doubt. as an eminent doctor himself. But we'll see if we can get him back for next week to talk about this. What do you think, Carlos?
Yeah, that would be great. I'll be tuning in as always, like every week.
Thank you, brother. We'll pass on your regards to Dr. Brar. Simon is in London. Let's hear from him. Simon, welcome.
How you doing, George? You okay?
All good. Thanks very much. What would you like to say?
Well, as you know, George, I'm a libertarian and believe in as little as no government as possible. So that's going to put us in, on the other side of the spectrum, total other side of the spectrum. However, many contractors like myself were therefore naturally disappointed when we got Boris elected in 2019, and he turned on us by bringing these ridiculous green policies, hiking up taxes, increasing spending, imposed these very strict regulations on us with regards to COVID-19. Now, the Conservatives lost North Shropshire for this reason, and of course for Boris and his staff not following the lockdown rules. But realistically, in my opinion, they don't really need to be that worried, because here's two reasons. Firstly, as your Professor John Curtice was saying earlier on, he lost the election to the Liberal Democrats, who even during the Blair era only really came in power when there's a protest vote or people don't want the majority opposition to take place. But secondly, and more damaging for the opposition, is that Keir Starmer and his opposition, the Labour Party, is infinitely worse than the Conservatives. Remember, the policies of Boris and Keir aren't that different with regards to COVID.
No, they're all Blairites. They're all Blairites.
Exactly.
All three of those parties are Blairites.
Exactly, but I compare...
We might as well bring Blair back, as Peter Hitchens was talking about. Everybody's following his policies. Why not bring them back?
Well, exactly, but let me make another comparison. I compare the transition between Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson, between Bush and Obama in America, where under Bush, the mainstream media just showed everything about Bush dropping bombs in Afghanistan and Iraq. Of course, it was devastating because, as you've mentioned yourself, he's the village idiot. He's a complete moron. And yet, when Obama took over, probably more bombs and missile attacks and so on were dropped in America, but the mainstream media seemed to be all hush-hush about this.
That's right. He looked nice in a tan suit. He could sing. He could sing Sam Cooke. He was a crooner.
No, absolutely, but but as you said, under the veil of mainstream media, and of course because he was black as well, they kind of picked on that, and suddenly everything was fine. I mean, he won the Nobel Prize for crying out loud. I don't know how he got away with that.
Well, he won it before he'd even started his work.
Exactly, but however, you said previously, both Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson are cheeks of the same derriere, to put it mildly. I mean, let's face it, in any debate where Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson pretty much have the same policies regarding COVID and lockdown, all Keir Starmer seems to be able to argue is mine's better than yours. Now, it's interesting because I don't know whether you remember, again, taking you back to the 2011 Republican nomination, there was a guy called Herman Cain. Do you remember that guy?
I don't actually, no.
Yeah, Herman Cain is the guy, a black man, believe it or not, who the Republicans put forward, and it might be something that you could Google or YouTube up. But
was he a surgeon? Was he a surgeon?
No, but he was Herman Cain was actually the surgeon was Ron Paul, I believe. Ron Paul was
there was a black surgeon came to the fore in the Republican Party.
I do know that he ran a pizza. I think it was a Pizza Hut or Pizza Express. I can't remember, but he was famous for turning their fortunes around. But basically, similarly to the Boris and Keir Starmer thing, when he got asked what you're going to do about Libya, because of course 2011-12 was the time when Obama and the Brits, of course, went to Libya and created all these ridiculous, horrific proxy wars. His only response was, firstly, he didn't know where Libya was, right? And secondly, he said, whatever Obama's done, I'll do better. And that's the kind of childish Neanderthal politics that Keir Starmer's playing now. And I totally agree with everyone else. I think Boris should go, but I don't think Boris will go. For starters, I think someone said a couple of weeks ago on GB News that he was a career politician. He's not going to go. And secondly, I mean, the Conservatives, over the long term, over 4 years, they'll probably lose some support. But I don't think they've got that much to worry about, to be honest with you. I mean, I would love to see, being a Thatcherite myself, I would love to see a Thatcher-type character take over.
Who would that be? Who would that be, Simon?
I don't think there's anyone there. I mean, Rishi Sunak and Priti Patel scare the hell out of me because they're far-right nut jobs, and both of them are Modi supporters, and people don't. I mean, we don't know anything about Rishi Sunak, but I just get this feeling that when he comes into power, it's going to be another Tony Blair issue where people will be obsessed with his look. He's a young guy. He's a good-looking guy. A lot of these woke supporters will support him, but they won't.
He's vastly rich. He's vastly rich.
Exactly.
At least he doesn't need to make money in the way that Tony Blair did. We've lost you, Simon. But thanks, top call, actually. Thanks very much for making it. Now, the Lockerbie disaster happened in this week in 1988. I remember I was in the Musicians Union Club in, I think in Sauchiehall Street in Glasgow when it happened. Which country was accused of being behind it? A, Russia, B, Iraq, C, Libya. Answer after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
The mother of all talk shows was created because early lunacy detection can save lives. At the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, some IQs declined by 90%. Now, doctors are diagnosing later stage lunacy, which could have been detected sooner. Don't wait. Share the mother of all talk shows with a loved one and speak to George Galloway about common sense today. It takes all of us to overcome idiots. Call the teacher today and get an education.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Well, Libya was, of course, blamed for the Lockerbie bombing, a terrorist atrocity, where a Pan American Airways jet, killing hundreds of people, came down not all that far from where I live. It was a major atrocity, and whoever was behind it deserves utter condemnation. But it's only fair to make the point that Libya was not the first suspect. Other people were suspected. Iran was suspected. Iranian-backed Palestinian militia groups were suspected. Libya completely denied involvement. And only after a somewhat unusual trial was a Libyan then convicted. Now look, I just want to make this clear. There is nothing that I'm saying, and if you've been listening to me throughout this pandemic, and if you were listening to our medical expert, Dr. Bra, that in any way seeks to downplay the significance of the pandemic, far from it. Neither are we a show which argues that people should not get vaccinated. I am vaccinated. We believe in vaccination. But we're not going to go along with every hue and cry that arises from the media, from the experts, from the politicians, if we're not persuaded of them. And I am not persuaded, and looking at the numbers on the poll, neither are the overwhelming majority of you that Omicron is the cataclysmic event that some of the media and many of the politicians are seeking to make it out to be. And moreover, the evidence that I have seen and heard, including with my own eyes, is that the Omicron is considerably less harmful than the hitherto dominant variant of the coronavirus 19, namely the Delta. And guess what? My colleague, Shadia Edwards-Dashti, whom you'll be familiar with on the show, my RT colleague here in London, she's got it. And she's on the line now. Shadia, I'm very sorry that you are poorly, but how poorly are you?
I think, George, you may be sorry that I'm cooped up in this room, but poorly I am not. I have not got a single symptom. I'm absolutely fine, but I'm absolutely furious at the same time because I am now stuck in this room, these four walls, for quite a long time. It's unclear whether it's 10 days from the day I tested positive or when I had symptoms. But of course, I don't have any symptoms and I haven't done since I was tested positive. So I'm quite frankly a furious colleague of yours right now.
Well, you see, this is one of many strange things. You can get the vaccination, but still get the virus. You can get the vaccination and still pass on the virus. You can even get the vaccination, get the virus, and still die. And you can get the virus and yet feel and look perfectly normal. How did this all come about?
Well, of course, George, there's just no way to know where I got it, when I got it, or where anybody may have got it. I myself am double vaccinated now, so this puts even more anger and frustration in me that I'm going by the government guidelines. I have always followed the guidelines in terms of these vaccinations, yet here I am. At the end of the day, George, this is a cold. This is nothing more than a cold that I had maybe a week ago with a few coughs and a few sneezes. Is that really enough to lock me in this room? And is that really enough to lock down a nation, which I feel is inevitable very, very soon?
Why did you get tested? What was it were you forced to get tested?
Yeah, I was actually at my friend's house. I was there on Friday evening and we were just about to have actually a few drinks. And I had a few coughs, literally a few coughs could have been from dust for all we know. And because she's in such a hysterical frenzy, which I think many people are, she said to me, take a lateral flow test. So I did. And then there it was. It was a positive lateral flow, which then was confirmed with a PCR. But, you know, must we get into this place in time that one person sneezes and we say, oh, my gosh, take a test? This is where we're at now, George.
Well, we may be. I mean, if my information is correct and Parliament is being recalled on Tuesday, it's not being recalled to toss flowers in the path of the Prime Minister. It's being recalled for some drastic reason. And from what you've said already, I infer that you, like me, think that would be a grave overreaction.
Absolutely a grave overreaction. We've already seen these Plan B restrictions being a total overreaction as well. And I don't mean face masks at all. I mean making it mandatory for people to get the vaccination in the NHS. That is a total infringement and curtailment of people's human rights. It's my body, it's my choice, and that should be applied to everybody, regardless what sector they're in. So that's already a step too far. But what we're going to see, most probably, is a total lockdown, which is going to be even worse for people in the NHS. But should we forget all of these staff cuts? Should we forget the funding cuts to the NHS, the total movement towards privatisation of the NHS? No, let's just blame this sneeze and this small round of coughing on the failures of the NHS, which is totally unfair. But for the individual, on an individual basis, if we go into lockdown, what does that mean for our civil liberties as well?
Well, civil liberties and also the economy. There are many businesses that didn't make it out of the last wave. There are many companies, businesses in which people work, on which they depend, which are hanging or were hanging by a thread. Another lockdown is going to see another huge leap in unemployment, isn't it?
We will absolutely see this. We have seen so many people that are self-employed, the hospitality sector, the arts, all of these great, great things that make Britain Britain. And we've seen them totally on their knees throughout the pandemic. And like you say, we will see many, many businesses shut up for good if they haven't already. And I think one thing that many people are asking right now is, why isn't the economy being put in more of a place of priority right now? And how is this happening when we look at politicians not following their own rules, when you only have to look at the seconds before a photograph is taken and suddenly politicians are putting on their masks? What does that really tell you if they're not following their own rules? Do they really think Omicron is as bad as they're making it out to be?
Well, of course, it can mean one of two things. Either that they don't really believe what they're telling us, and that's why they're in the Downing Street garden having wine and cheese, having parties, or like a famous ITV television reporter sitting at the press conference in Downing Street the other night with no mask on until the camera rolls when he's got a mask on. Either it means they themselves don't believe what they are saying, or they're being absolutely reckless in the way that they denounce others for being. All I can say is, I'm glad you're not poorly, and you are rather magnificent when you're angry. Shadia Edwards-Dashti, thanks very much for joining us. Now, look, as I said earlier, we are the last people, if you're a regular viewer and listener, you already know, we are the last people. We're not conspiracy theorists. We don't believe that the vaccination is putting a chip in you so that Rishi Sunak can know where Senga from Clydebank is on a Friday evening at 7 o'clock. We don't believe any of that. But neither will we go along with repeated lockdowns, devastation to the economy, and infringements on basic liberties that have no justification. If we think they're lacking in justification, we'll argue that. But the good thing is, because this is a university, it's what universities used to be like. You are invited to speak back to the teacher. Let's go to O'Keefe in New York City. Go ahead, O'Keefe.
Yes. Good evening, George. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate coming on your program.
Welcome, bro.
I want to talk about China, right? It was like 4 or 5 years ago I started to dig in down on the information about China. And I could say that it can be accredited as well to be on all of the propaganda that has been fed to us over here, because, you know, we are open to these stations that are here, right? But one thing I found funny, because while I'm getting information, I do history, right? Mm-hmm. And I see that it's all these same countries that are elite, that are guilty of all the things that they're accusing China for. They are accusing China for it right now and behaves as if like they are the saving grace. You know what I mean? And everything that comes out on these third world nations that has deals or relationship with China is as if they're forcing us to like view China in a bad light and like there's some peril coming. And I can tell you that it is working, because I see that it's getting worse. Even though I'm a person of open mind, I know that I can see through all the propaganda and the hypocrisy and the lies. I see where regular individuals that knew nothing about China, only what they are being spewed.
Yeah, there's a lot of sheep around, O'Keefe. All I know is that China is building 1,000 schools in Iraq. 1,000 schools that were destroyed by British and American occupation and invasion.
Yeah, all I'm saying, like, it's not fair. I like when you touch these topics, because a lot of people like me, and I was 26 when I got open to this information. And imagine a 26-year-old just knowing that there's another part of the world where You know what I mean? A lot of things was going on, and all the lies that we were told in our colonial education system didn't give us this open mind to think critically. Even though we go through the university system and speak eloquently based on how they teach us, but it's like when you just finding out that all these are lies, it creates a level of stress and strain on you. And when you see people coming out and say, "Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist," or "You're a China backer or a Russia backer,"
you're like, on the payroll. Yes, your pockets are filled with.
Yeah, you know what I mean?
yuan.
One more point before I go. It's
Very quickly.
Very quickly. It's like the same people. I heard a commentator said on this the other day. An Australian politician would say like the same people who would look through the lies of these Western governments about Russia, you're finding it hard to like say, no, China isn't a good person. China is a bad person. And, you know, these are the same people who see through the same lies that these Western governments were saying. So,
well, lies told by the same people. The same people who told the lies about Iraq. in the war. Okay, thanks for that. I need to press on. Richard is in Manchester, in England. Go ahead, Rich.
Good evening, George. Thanks very much for having me on.
Welcome. Go ahead.
A very Merry Christmas to all your 110 countries that you have got under your belt now, and congratulations. You deserve all your success.
Thank you so much.
And your team.
Thank you so much. God bless you.
I'd like to just touch on this report today that was out about Theresa May.
Oh, I didn't see that. What has she done?
£170,000 for 4-hour Zoom call lectures from JP Morgan over the past few weeks.
Goodness gracious me. I wouldn't cross the road to hear Theresa May speak.
She only made one good speech. Lancaster House. After that, you can put the next 3 or 4 years into the dustbin because she did nothing. And that's how much she got from JP Morgan. That is a fact.
That's incredible.
Incredible.
For a Zoom speech. You didn't even get to dance with her.
She didn't get to hold the president's hand while she was blurbing. Oh, it's terrible. But when you reckon that her and her husband...
well, he's already vastly rich.
Oh, he's very, very rich man. Serco.
I wonder what she first saw in him.
Don't make me laugh, George, because I could give you an answer to that, but you'd probably cut me off. I'd just like to also say about Peter Hitchens in the Telegraph today, George, saying that Sakir is staying put. These are more or less his words, like a piece of wood, not being effective in opposition because the
Messiah... He said he had the charisma of a wardrobe.
Mr. Blair is going to make a comeback and save the UK from itself by getting us back into the EU. And you know, George, if you sit back and analyse that and look at what's been going on...
Well, and a lot of people denied it, Rich, but I wish I was as sure as they are, those who are denying it, that it definitely could never happen. They say that the British public would never accept him and so on. I wish I was as confident that they wouldn't as some of the critics of Peter's article today are.
But George, can I just get on to China and Russia? I mean, I'm 78 now, and I've been to Russia and I've been to China. And honestly, George, over the years, to see what the presidents of China, when I first went, it wasn't Xi, it was whoever, and they've come on and brought billions of people out of poverty in China. It's
800 million people have been lifted out of poverty in the last 40 years in China. 800 million. Over the same 40 year, Rich, we've put an awful lot of people back into poverty that had only just clambered out of it. Thanks very much, as always, for the call. We're, after the news, going to Washington, D.C., to RT America's one and only Rachel Blevins. And we'll be talking Sex in the City. But the rest of the hour, you can do what you like. You can call me. The poll's finished, by the way, and 2,600 people voted, and overwhelmingly, you think that Omicron is being exaggerated. I honestly think that is a very widely held perception. Here's the news with Jamie Lowe.
Radio Sputnik News.
The UK Health Secretary Shadia Edwards-Dashti has refused to rule out plans for a 2-week circuit breaker lockdown after Christmas, as he accused those unwilling to have the COVID vaccine of having a damaging impact on society. When pushed on reports that ministers are drawing up plans to introduce more restrictions after Christmas, he said that the government will do what is necessary, but that any change must be backed up by the data. He also confirmed that Parliament would be recalled if the government believed introducing further restrictions was necessary. Professor Sir Mark Woolport, a member of the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, or SAGE, asked if the data suggests further restrictions are needed right now. In a word, he said yes. He said infections are rising fast and there needs to be time allowed for recently administered vaccines and boosters to take effect. Senior government scientists have also said that extra restrictions are needed within days to prevent hospitals from being overwhelmed by Omicron. Possible tougher measures could be imposed after Boxing Day, according to reports, although a contingency plan has not yet been presented to ministers. Experts who produce advice for ministers believe there are now hundreds of thousands of infections every day, many more than the number of official cases recorded on the daily dashboard. Senior officials in Scotland have also suggested that the country could face tougher COVID-19 restrictions around New Year. Clinical Director Professor Jason Leach said it was better to act harder and early, while Scotland Office Minister Ian Stewart said big decisions may need to be made. A Four Nations Cobra meeting is being held today following calls for more financial support for businesses. However, Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has said she has no plans to recall Holyrood to discuss further measures. British businesses have reacted with dismay at possible tougher COVID measures before Christmas after the Health Secretary said they could not be ruled out. Kate Nichols, Chief Executive of UK Hospitality, which represents many restaurants, hotels and leisure firms, said further restrictions would be devastating for the industry. It's better to trade even a little bit than be closed down altogether, she said. There are a lot of costs closing down sites and then reopening them. Having a fourth lockdown would be the final nail in the coffin for some businesses. Germany has become the latest European country to ban most travellers from Britain to try and slow the spread of the Omicron variant. German nationals and residents will still be allowed to enter from the UK. The measures will take effect from this evening. France has already introduced similar curbs as coronavirus infections surge in Britain. The Netherlands has entered into a tough lockdown to curb the spread of Omicron, with non-essential shops, bars, restaurants and other public places to close. Schools will also shut from Monday and the lockdown will run until at least the 14th of January, Prime Minister Mark Rutte announced. Piers Corbyn, the brother of former Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn, has been arrested on suspicion of encouraging people to attack MPs' offices. He was arrested in South London early this morning. The Metropolitan Police said the arrest related to a video filmed during a rally in London against COVID restrictions. The video shared on social media on Saturday evening appears to show the 74-year-old prominent anti-vaccination campaigner criticising MPs who supported the introduction of Plan B measures. After decrying those scum who have decided to go ahead with introducing new fascism, he tells a crowd to find out if their MPs have supported the new restrictions. The United States Senator Joe Manchin, a Democrat, has said that he cannot support President Joe Biden's sweeping social, climate and spending bill, striking a defensive blow to the Democrats' agenda. He said bluntly it's a no on the $1.7 trillion package in an interview on Fox News Sunday. If I can't go home and explain to the people of West Virginia, I can't vote for it, and I cannot vote to continue with this piece of legislation. I just can't. I've tried everything humanly possible, and I can't get there, Manchin said. In announcing his opposition, Manchin raised the same concerns about the bill that he's had all along: inflation, rising debt, and a mismatch between the package's 10-year funding and its shorter-term programmes. With an evenly split Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer needs every Democrat to go along with the legislation, which only requires a simple majority vote. That gives Manchin enormous leverage over Biden's agenda, allowing him to single-handedly sink a priority that Democrats have spent much of the year working on. More than 100 people are now thought to have died after a devastating storm struck the Philippines on Thursday. Super Typhoon Rai, with winds of about 195 kilometers per hour, sent some 300,000 people running for safety when it hit the country's southeastern islands. Rescue teams have described scenes of complete carnage. Establishing the scale of the losses has proved difficult, as communication to a number of areas has been cut off. At least 120 deaths have been reported, according to AFP news agency, with fierce landslides and flooding may have claimed many more. And finally, the number of people choosing to play as Wrexham AFC in the popular computer game Football Manager has surged since the club's Hollywood takeover. The National League club's profile has risen massively since actors Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney bought it in February. More than 5,000 people are currently playing as Wrexham in the game since its latest version was released last month, about a 200% rise. In the real world yesterday, rather than the virtual one, Wrexham won 5-0 against Gloucester City in the third round of the FA Cup. And that's the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway, only on Sputnik Radio.
I know there's no vacancy, but humour me, there's going to be. Boris Johnson will not remain in number 10 Downing Street for very much longer. I'm not at liberty to tell you the things that are coming down the pipe, but I've seen some of the videos, some of the WhatsApp messages, and I've heard secondhand from people who have and who tell me that Boris Johnson, now hanging on by his fingernails, will not remain in power for very much longer. But even if you don't believe me, humour me. If he walked under the Clapham omnibus, and I'm sure that he could never be so blind drunk as to do that, but if he did have too much wine and cheese and walked out into Whitehall and the Clapham omnibus ran over him, who would succeed him? Now, this is not a recommendation. It's not an endorsement. I, in one level, couldn't care less who is the leader of the British Conservative Party. Trust me. But it is my job to try and predict events, to try and be ahead of the curve. And so last night, when I pointed out that this all bore an uncanny resemblance to the last days of Margaret Thatcher to me, and I was there in Parliament, sitting opposite him, when Geoffrey Howe, the departing foreign Chancellor of the Exchequer, devastated the premiership of Margaret Thatcher. I heard him talk about being sent in to bat, only to discover that the captain had broken the bat and the wickets and the bails and so on. And although you could have heard a pin drop that day, the noise afterwards was very considerable, and it led to the defenestration of Mrs. Thatcher. This all has that feel of it to me. My own view is that the main future of the Conservative Party lies in a new set of hands. Someone like Sunak, if they go down the Liberal route, or someone like Baker, if they go down the right-wing Libertarian route, or maybe even people we've not heard of yet. But what the Conservative Party is likely to do if the Prime Minister departs prematurely, which I predict that he will, is go for somebody to steady the ship as an interim Prime Minister who will not fight the next election as their leader, but steady the ship over the next 12 months or so. And that's why I think that Michael Gove will be the man to get the gig. I think other people will quickly be found out as being made of straw. Liz Truss, for example, is made of straw. Dominic Raab is as thick as two planks of wood nailed together. Rishi Sunak is super smooth and silky and filthy rich, but I don't believe he has established himself yet in the public's mind, in the party's mind, to be given the gig right away. But I appreciate that that is a minority view. So we're asking on this poll, who will succeed Boris Johnson as Prime Minister? A, Rishi Sunak. B, Dominic Raab. C, Liz Truss. You can vote on my Twitter feed, on my YouTube, on my Telegram. One person who doesn't have to worry about any of that is my RT America colleague, Rachel Blevins. She doesn't care whether it's Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss because she's living under Joe Biden, can you imagine? Rachel, welcome back to the show. Always a delight to see you. Speaking of Joe Biden, he's hung his hat on this bill, this mega spending bill. I don't refer to the mega spending defense budget, but the bill to rebuild, refloat the American economy after the pandemic. But it now looks as if it's not going to go through because there's one Democratic Party holdout who's going to sink it. Tell us.
Yeah, it has turned into good old Senator Joe Manchin being the one to sink Biden's entire presidency in just a morning if you focus only on the headlines that we've seen so far. And if you listen to the statement that we got from Press Secretary Jen Psaki earlier today. Now, it's interesting because when we're talking about this $2 trillion spending bill, it is more than 2,000 pages long. And that is still crazy to me that this is the way that Congress does things. Instead of getting on the floor, instead of actually doing their job and going through each individual issue, voting on it individually and debating on it individually. Instead, what they do is they cram it into this massive bill. And we have to remember that this current, as they refer to it, the Build Back Better bill, this is what Democrats have really been promising because they just passed another package a few weeks ago, which was specifically aimed at infrastructure. However, it didn't include a lot of the things that Democrats like Joe Biden had campaigned on in terms of childcare, in terms of funding for certain climate change initiatives and the likes. However, Democrats said, hey, we've got the majority in the House, the Senate, and the White House. We are going to make sure that all of those other policies are passed. We're going to include it in this new bill. But the problem with doing that is that they needed every single Democrat to support it. So when you have someone like Joe Manchin who comes out and says, actually, I'm not able to vote for this, I'm going to have to vote no, then that turns the entire plan into chaos. And it's crazy to think about the fact that we're literally looking at something that is being voted on down party lines instead of looking at each individual issue and deciding, okay, what do the American people need right now? What should be prioritized right now? Instead of doing that, they're wanting to pass something that is $2 trillion and is apparently held up by a single senator's vote. And the reason that Manchin says that he can't support it is because it's adding to the national debt, which is now nearly $30 trillion. And it always makes me laugh whenever members of Congress start talking about the national debt and start warning about it, because they raise that debt ceiling like it's nobody's business. I mean, they've done it dozens of times. It's become almost an expected thing that whenever they decide that they want to spend more, whenever they decide that they want to print more money, they just go in there and raise the debt ceiling a little higher. So I guess now that it's getting to nearly $30 trillion, they're deciding that they just may have an issue with it.
What's $30 trillion between friends. What can Joe Biden do to this recalcitrant senator? Is he biddable? Is he buyable? Is he browbeatable?
Well, apparently it's sounding like he's not at the moment, given the fact that he has every single Democrat now calling him out and saying that he is the one who is to blame if this doesn't go through. And, you know, it's interesting because, of course, they're going to try to put all of the blame for any of Biden's failings onto Joe Manchin now. Before it was Kamala Harris. Now they found a new person to pick. But we have to remember that Biden's approval ratings were already tanking. Americans are already concerned about the fact that we have inflation here near 40-year highs, about the fact that our economy as a whole is struggling. We're seeing gas prices skyrocket. I mean, there are so many individual things that we should be focusing on, but instead now the media as a whole, and of course the Biden administration, gets to just point at Joe Manchin and act like they're going to, make something happen in terms of going after his career.
And this is when the Democrats control the White House, the Senate, and the House. What about after the midterms, when they almost certainly lose control of two of those three arms of government?
Exactly. And it's interesting because they have put so much around this Build Back Better plan, saying that the midterms are riding on them passing this funding, passing this $2 trillion package. And yeah, exactly. If they're not able to pass it, if they go into the new year, then that does not look good for the Democrats, because they told everyone, you get Trump out of office, you make sure that there is a Democratic majority all around, and we will give you everything that we've been campaigning for. And now they're showing that that's something that they're not able to follow through on.
Now, I was caught, I read the New York Times at weekends, and I saw that they had some really dramatic news about the number of people that have been slaughtered by errant, one assumes they're errant, aerial drones. The number of people in the Middle East that are being wiped out by these drones, and we know about the 10 people that were killed in Kabul, 7 of them children. What is it with these drones? Why the fixation with sending drones when, as Daniel Hale pointed out, the vast majority of them don't hit the target that they're intended to?
Yeah, I know whenever those drones were introduced, and specifically when the Obama administration came in, one of the things that they promised with this, that this was going to be a much more precise way to take out their targets. And, it was going to be different than what we saw with the Bush administration in terms of putting boots on the ground. But yes, exactly. Now we've got the New York Times speaking out about it, reporting on just how often civilians are killed. And it is incredibly concerning when you look at the fact that this is spanning not only the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now we're getting into the Biden administration. And these precise killing machines, these predator drones, as they're called, are too often taking out civilians, too often not hitting actual targets. And it is notable because just as we saw this last week, what the Pentagon does is when something like that happens, when they see that there are several civilians that are killed, they look at it and they say, no further investigation needed. They say that no charges should be filed. They shrug it off and say, oh, it's an accident, we need to just move on, when too often those are incidents that actually need to be investigated. And the reason that they continue to happen is because these military members know that there will be no accountability, that there will be no consequences. And then oftentimes, as we've seen, as the cases with Daniel Hell, with Julian Assange, with a number of those people who have actually spoken out about it, the people who are targeted, the people who actually face consequences, are those who reveal just how devastating these drone strikes are, who reveal that to the public, and the people who are responsible for them are the ones who walk away free and who are even celebrated for their patriotism here in this country.
Lastly and briefly, if you would, Rachel, the trial of Ghislaine Maxwell is coming to a rather abrupt end. It has not gone on, or is not going to go on, as long as had been provided for. What's your feeling? Is she going to be convicted or not?
If she is convicted, I could see it being much more of a slap on the wrist, especially the way that this has played out, with the fact that she has constantly been painted as this poor, helpless woman who was just pulled into Jeffrey Epstein's web as, her team has tried to put the emphasis on the fact that this is a trial that Epstein never got to have. And it's unfortunate because even in the cases where we have been able to hear from victims who had their lives destroyed by Ghislaine Maxwell, by Jeffrey Epstein, all too often they are sort of painted as just opportunists who should have been happy with the payout that they got if they got one at all, and who are just doing this for attention. So I really do hope that this is one of those cases where we see more and more being brought against her. But at the moment, when it comes to having faith in the U.S. justice system, especially when it comes to this trial, I can honestly say that I do not have much.
Rachel, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us on this busy evening. I've got a call from Hawaii. What about that? Mateo in Hawaii. Can we hear him?
George, are you there?
I am. Mateo, how wonderful of you to call. We had a guest on from Hawaii earlier.
Yes, that's right. Thank you. This is my second time calling. I love your show. Thanks for taking my call.
Thank you, sir. Go on.
I have three questions. The first one is it obvious to anyone that the only people that I see anyway that are overreacting to COVID are governments and mainstream medias around the world? And is it possible that they are fear-mongering?
Well, of course, they're not the only people. There are many doctors and scientists who are providing the, if you like, the intellectual scaffolding on which governments are building their case. I mean, I heard today a scientist from the SAGE, which is the scientific advisory group that advises the British government, demanding early lockdowns. And I just don't see how the case for that has been made. That's my view.
That's my view as well. And my next two questions actually interlink with that. Like a placebo effect, when someone is given a medication and they think it's the real thing, but it's actually a sugar pill or a saline solution, it tends to work because they believe or they're told that it's a medicine that will work. Just like that, is it possible that if an entire population is put into fear about a disease, then just on a lot of people, just on the first little symptom, they're going to all run to the hospital and get tested for this or that or whatever they're told it is. And then if they're told they have it, they're in such fear that they have it, even if they don't, and even possibly die because of this fear that they've been placed in.
Look, millions of people have died from this virus. We shouldn't make light of it. And that has happened all over the world. It's happened in Russia, it's happened in China, it's happened in Vietnam, it's happened in Korea, it's happened everywhere, whatever the political and economic system is. In fact, it's happened in countries that are extremely adversarial towards each other. There's no reason at all, as I keep saying, why the Castroite government in Cuba would invent the existence of this virus. It's a real thing. It has wreaked havoc.
I'm not saying it's not real, and I'm not saying it's not real, and I'm not saying that I'm not trying to make light of it. I'm just saying that you could make something that's just simply a type of a cold that's not really that dangerous into something that is dangerous by somebody believing it.
No, it must be dangerous because enough people have died that it's manifestly dangerous. But my
take let's go to my last question, can I?
All right, go on.
Okay, and it has to do with the PCR test. Simply stated, the inventor of the PCR test, his name is Kary Mullis, or was Kary Mullis, and he said many times that the PCR test is worthless for diagnosing anything. There's a video interview with Kary Mullis very shortly before he died, where he says that he repeats that the PCR test is worthless for diagnosing anything. It's simply a magnifying tool, And he also called, in this interview, Dr. Fauci a complete bureaucratic idiot who knows absolutely nothing. Okay? He mysteriously died of pneumonia 3 months before the pandemic started.
I'll check that out, Matteo. I can't vouch for those facts that you've just stated, but I will check it out. Thanks for the call. Ricardo is in Milton Keynes. Let's hear from him. Go ahead, Ricardo.
Hello, George. Thanks for getting through. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
I want to say I didn't really I don't know how it works. So listening to your previous caller, I agree partly with what they say about how it's so, if it's possible to invent some kind of rather.
He had the idea that rather like a placebo, if you tell people often enough that there's a virus out there that's going to kill them, it might kill them. That seems rather unscientific to me.
Well, because fear does a horrible thing to the immune system. It actually brings the immune system down, making you more susceptible. So I suppose you could sort of call it that because you don't realise you're being you don't realise you're being fear-mongered. You don't, without thinking about it, you think, oh, I'm ill and I didn't know it. Then before you know it, you're ill because you didn't realise, and fear just conquers the immune system partly, and then that's what it does. And
that all sounds unlikely to me. But go ahead, Ricardo. What would you like to say?
I also can't help but to feel like that it was all too easy to scare people through the media that have slowly over time become controlled. But also, I feel like that people themselves, they're not being sold so much like an actual virus-preventing vaccine. That we all know doesn't really do anything, if it does anything at all, if you can even call it a vaccine, which I highly doubt that it is, even if it is, because I just don't really believe that it's not, that it is. I myself haven't had it, and I don't want it, and legally, I can't have it, and I'm not allowed to have it. It's quite strange and funny when you realise that the actual legal forms that you can find online, download, they're very quick to tell you about virus vaccine, go and get it, it's a no-brainer, you must have it. But then the legal forms that suggest that you don't have to have it, they don't really sort of want to put that alongside. They try and hide it. And I find it interesting, recently Britain, Boris goes and buys another 1 million doses of this vaccine? I feel like that there's just basically money to be made from somewhere.
Well, there's no doubt that big pharmaceutical companies have made huge money from this. Some of it justifiable, much of it not. There's been a lot of profiteering. There's been a lot of corruption in the allocation of resources. But the vaccine has stopped a lot of the widespread hospitalization that was occurring and has stopped the apparently inexorable rise of the death toll, which a year ago, 18 months ago, was hugely over the annual average in Britain. I think I would sum my view up this way, Ricardo, and I'll have to let you go. The virus is not as deadly as we first feared, and the vaccines are not as effective as we first hoped. That squares with my lifelong belief that nothing is as good or as bad as it first appears. Thanks, Ricardo, for the call. Nathan is in Falkirk. Go ahead, Nathan.
How you doing, George?
All right, nice to hear from you. What would you like to say?
Hello.
Yes, go ahead. You're on the air.
Hi.
I've lost Nathan. Is Nathan still there? Let me read some social media then. Kevin says, the only party that rocked the Conservatives was UKIP. And on that note, I'm going to rejoin the party and give it my support again. I hope and pray that history will repeat itself. Jim L. in Fort Collins says, sounds like Hawaii is getting the Flint Michigan water treatment. Yeah, that's right. P.S. You didn't miss anything with not seeing It's a Wonderful Life. My family always look forward to watching A Christmas Carol with Alistair Sim. And Mubashir says, massive fan for years, keep up the great work. There's been quite a bit of concern about the new Nationality and Borders Bill introduced by the government. Is it something we should be concerned about? Does it give the government the power to take away our passports? Well, the government took that power quite some time ago when I was in Parliament and opposing it. David Stamps in Birmingham says, well, if another lockdown is announced soon, then it's nothing to do with a virus. And on the poll, Graham Lang says, absolutely no doubt, Liz Truss, the silent assassin. You see, I just don't see that. To me, she's a pound shop Margaret Thatcher, though not fit to polish her tank. Let me take a quick break.
Radio Sputnik.
Preferred the old format where George was actually writing his own monologue to start off the show, instead of the scripted RT half stand-up comedy routine rubbish. Where is the passion gone, George? I don't know where to start with that. I really don't, Budrick. First of all, I have never, ever written a single word that I have ever said. I don't write scripts. I don't have a script. RT doesn't write a stand-up comedy routine script for me. RT doesn't write anything for me or give me any advice as to what I should say in any circumstances. I am the freest commentator in the entire media world. I have worked for RT for more than a decade without a single person ever saying to me that they would like me to say this or that they would not like me to say that. You idiot. There you go. There is no auto cue. There is no script. Far less one that's written by RT. What's wrong with you, man? As a matter of fact, the most criticism I get in comments on Facebook, on YouTube, is that I'm doing too much shouting. And you're now demanding more passion. I'll give you passion. Why don't you call me? 08081 965522. Call me right now, and I will passionately, verbally, box your ears for you.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Now, Michael McCaffery, another colleague of mine at RT.com, is by far and away the best film critic anywhere, in any medium. And I sincerely mean that. I read everything that he writes, and you should too. In fact, you should follow him on social media, as well as reading him on RT.com. But I don't always bring his work to the wider public in the way that I'm doing so this evening. I'm doing so this evening for the simple reason that his review of Sex in the City is simultaneously the best written review of any film I've ever read, but also the most savagely funny film review that I've ever read. Now, I know some of you will be saying, well, Sex in the City, why are we discussing this on the mother of all talk shows? Well, we don't let popular culture go unnoticed here. And millions of people, including me and my good wife, have watched Sex in the City, albeit we knew that it was, as it were, framing and eulogizing some of the worst values of American capitalism. And we watched because, well, you need to know what the enemy is putting out and what is going into the minds of the people in the enemy's countries. So I've always had a jaundiced but interested view in Sex in the City. Michael McCaffery, well, he's just jaundiced. And here he is to give us just a scintilla, Michael, of the savage eloquence with which you denounced this film. Give me your top few points.
Well, first of all, thank you, George, for that stunning introduction. And I'm almost speechless.
I mean it, absolutely.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much. And I think the first question we have to ask here is, out of the two of us, who is more a glutton for punishment? Me for watching these shows, or you for having me on to talk about them? That's something we should discuss.
But nothing human is alien to me, Michael, as Dr. Marx said.
Exactly. So, yeah, Sex in the City, which ran on HBO, it was one of their iconic shows. It ran from 98 to 2004. And, of course, was about 4 women, feminists out in the world sort of looking for, life, love, and lust in New York City. Well, they're back after about a 16 or 17-year break. 3 of the 4 are back anyway. And it's really rough to watch. It's on HBO if you do want to partake in that sort of torture. But I was not a fan of the first show for reasons I wrote about, namely that it was this sort of vacuous capitalism porn that was teaching a whole generation of Karens in waiting to sort of want to find fulfillment and freedom through the slavery of wanting to buy products that they don't need at prices they couldn't afford. And that's the jumping off point for watching And Just Like That, which is the name of the new show. And this show is so irritating to watch. First of all, the women, of course, are all very, very rich, and none of them really have to work. Most of them are such wonderful feminists. They live on their husband's wealth, and all they do is have lunch. And the other problem with the show is that it's totally unnecessary. And Sex in the City has gotten a lot of heat recently because of how it was back in the day. All the women are white, all of their friends were white, everybody they interacted with were white, and that is a problem nowadays. And so it feels like the show was just created to find redemption for that original sin of whiteness. And so they have all these token characters of color throughout. But it's a tough watch, George.
They've gone woke. They've gone super woke.
Yes. They've gone super woke. And what's really amazing about it is, again, I was not a fan of the original show. I'm not its target audience, so that's okay. But those characters, and even the women who played them, were really the embodiment of this sort of, the notion of a free-thinking, a feminist, that they didn't care what people thought about them. They were going to go against convention, particularly in television at the time. That it was a real transition to like these empowered women, empowered sexually and things like that. And now, 17 years later, they have this existential dread of offending anyone. And they're totally compliant. They never push back about against the conventions, the social conventions that are placed upon them, which is the exact opposite of what the characters did 17 years ago. And it's just so interesting to me because as I wrote the piece, it reminds me of all these, sort of neo-feminist Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris supporters who don't really care about anything except wanting to be accepted into the cool kids group. And that's what these women are. And that's, I'm sure, what their fans are. Although I have to say on Rotten Tomatoes, the audience has given it a 39% rotten mark. So it's not really resonating with fans of the original show either. And it's not resonating with me.
But obviously. I bet that Hillary and Kamala are big fans of it. And I bet the characters are big fans of them.
Oh, without question. Yeah, without question. And, I lived in New York back when the show was running. I was a single man out and about in the world. And this sort of the scourge of that show upon the psyche of all of these women of a certain age, and the things that it made them want to become. And these are the people who are now in power, supporters of Hillary and Kamala. And they don't actually believe in anything except being accepted. And so they don't push back against, as you have come to learn, against, say, the label of being a TERF, a trans-exclusionary radical feminist. So women like J.K. Rowling, who, survive an abusive relationship and being dirt poor, and through nothing but just the sheer power of their imagination and creativity and resilience, become enormously successful, write this book that, so many children, for generations, just love. And she's sort of kicked out of polite society because she says women are women and trans women are trans women. But that's not acceptable to like the sort of Sex and the City, Hillary Kamala group, because that offends people. That offends some people, even though back in the day, they didn't care about offending people. They cared about following their quote unquote truth. And now they're just ashamed of that. And it's really bizarre. There's a character in the show, the lead character, Carrie, who her job now, or I use air quotes around job, is to be, she co-hosts a podcast on sex. And the host of the show is a non-binary, gender fluid, queer, Latinx comedian. And it's insane that this woman, Carrie, who literally used to write an article about Sex in the City and all her sexcapades and all these things, she's now just ashamed and shocked at how prudish she is compared to this comedian who, the most remarkable thing about this character is that she's a comedian, but she's not even remotely funny. It's just so bizarre because it's not in keeping with the character, but it is in keeping with current social conventions. And that's the weirdest thing to me, to be creating a show that is really sort of sticking a thumb in the eye of the show that made you famous, 20 years ago. It's a bizarre thing. And it's a terrible show. Terrible.
They just can't move on. Michael, is your review still up on the RT.com site?
It is. It is up on the RT.com site. Interestingly, when I pitched RT, the headline for that, the headline read, "And just like that, I threw up in my mouth." But they decided to change it. So you're going to have to look for a different headline because they thought the readers wouldn't understand what I meant. So, but that's how I felt when I watched the show.
Don't I know it? I've read your review. It is coruscating and coruscatingly brilliant. Michael McCaffery, thanks as always for joining us. I wish we had more time, but the calls are flooding in. Who will succeed Boris Johnson as Prime Minister? Rishi Sunak, 55%. Dominic Raab, 11%. Who thinks that? And Liz Truss, the pound shop Thatcherite, 34%. She's got a third of the vote across all platforms. Nathan in Falkirk, whom we lost earlier, let's try and get him back. Nathan, welcome.
George, how are you doing? Good to speak to you.
And you, go ahead. Okay? Go ahead.
Yes, George, I'd just like to say and get your views on this. The thing that really annoys me about this whole thing is the government have spent 2 years telling us that the way back to our freedoms and our liberty was going to be the vaccine. That if we complied with vaccinations, we would be back to normal, that we would have our freedoms back, that we would have liberty back. And here we are, 2 years later, with more therapeutics and more treatments than we've had in the previous 2 years, and we've had 90-odd% of the population vaccinated, and the government are yet again talking about another lockdown. And would it not be obvious that most majority of sane-thinking people would at this point be beginning to think, well, maybe the government, in telling us all these things for the last 2 years, are actually the biggest spreaders of vaccine misinformation, Because if the vaccines worked and the policy that the government told us and spent 2 years trying to convince us that we would have our freedoms back, if nothing is going to change as a result of our compliance, when will this ever end? And the other thing that really annoys me about the whole thing is we continually are told we've got to support the NHS, which is true. We have to support the NHS. But is it not the case before COVID came, there was a winter bed crisis nearly every single year? In actual fact, people pay into the NHS for the NHS to support it, not the other way around. The fact that the government have made such a mess of the NHS is their problem. And it's about time that sane-thinking people stood up and said, we're not having any more of this. We've done what you've asked us. We now have Omicron, and the government are using the same tactics they did against ordinary people during Brexit. You're thick, you're stupid, you need scientists to tell you. And we believe in scientists, but what we don't believe in...
We do, but war, as Napoleon said, war's too important to be left to generals, and these matters are too important to be left to scientists. Great call, Nathan. Don't be a stranger. We'll get Dr. Brar on next week, and we'll make a major part of the show next week, how this is all developing. I expect, if I'm right about Tuesday and the recall of Parliament, there will be plenty more to discuss. Let's hear from Casey in Belfast. Go ahead, Casey.
George, how are you? So nobody is speaking about the impact on quarantines on children. I mean, children are being affected by closure of schools the most. It's terrible. The gap between private education and public education is increasing.
Well, the schools are not closing. Are they closing in Belfast? My children's school isn't closed.
They're not closing in Belfast, but I mean, there are some people that are campaigning apparently to close schools and close everything.
Yeah, there are.
And it concerns me because children, 80-year-old children, if they don't go to school, they're just going to be playing video games and watching television at their homes. And they're being told at school, with this social distancing thing, that they can't hug or play with their mates because they have to socially distance. A child who's 8 years old has been a quarter of its life with a face mask at school. It's crazy. It's crazy. And I know that many people say, well, we are doing this for the virus, for the health, but we can't. Public health is not only about one virus. Public health is also about cancer. It's also about dealing with other health issues. And it seems like the NHS, it's only doing things about and is only taking measures about COVID, while we're not talking about cancer treatment, which in Scotland, I think there is a big of a crisis because
our whole health service in Scotland is in a crisis. I promise you, Casey, we'll return to this matter next week. Clear the lines. There's a legend on the line. Norma in Bristol. Always a pleasure, Norma. What would you like to say?
Hello, can you hear me? Because you're very quiet.
Very clearly indeed.
Oh, that's all right then. I've just got 2 or 3 points. On PBS America on TV today, I watched this program, and it was called Love, Not Hate. And it covered interviews with white supremacists and the Ku Klux Klan, and all the hate and horror was shown. But a few years later, they were helped with Muslims and the LGBT and Jewish and African American communities, and they faced their guilt. And what they did was what they call converted to love, not hate. I mean, it's funny really, because by mixing, they sort of realized their fears were unfounded and they were ashamed of what they did. And I thought it was a bit poignant at this particular time of year. It was only a few of them, but they changed their really vile...
Well, I'm one of these that believes that humanity can be changed for the better. I've struggled all of my life on that. If I believed that bad people were irrevocably bad and could never be converted, never persuaded, never changed, I wouldn't have gone into politics. I would have, I don't know, sold brushes door to door. So I absolutely believe that we have a duty to work to improve humanity, definitely.
And the other thing is, yeah, it was good. My son's got COVID. My daughter-in-law's just had it.
Is it Omicron, do you know?
Well, I asked him that. He said he doesn't really know till he gets his PB, whatever it is, back.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, he hasn't been well, but he's getting better. And I hope he'll be able to come over on Christmas Day because he lives on his own, you know. But just hoping that. But it isn't that bad, you see, like you're saying.
I mean, how long is he isolating?
Well, it's supposed to be 10 days, and
a positive, rather a negative test, yeah.
Yeah. But, I mean, the last thing, George, honestly, you know that Hawaiian man,
yes.
Kaniela Ing?
Yes.
Oh, do you know, George, I thought he was so dishy.
He's very handsome, yeah. He's got a big future in politics, that young man.
Well, I'm sure he has, but I just looked at him and I thought, God, you're attractive. You know, I'm an old lady, but I thought you're so
Your husband could be listening to this, Norma.
Well, he will. Yeah, he will. I repeat it. I take it to him later. Yeah.
You'll be getting into trouble. Well, look, the very best to you, your husband, and your children, and their partners, and their children, of course. We'll be on air next week, of course, on Boxing Day. Yeah, the show goes on, so make sure you tune in, 7 o'clock Boxing Day. It's better than anything that's going to be on the television, but happy Christmas when it comes. Darren is in Southend. Let's hear from him. Darren, welcome.
Hello, George. Good to hear from you again, mate. I just wanted to wish you a happy Christmas, you and your family, and a very good New Year before, unless I don't speak to you before next week. But yeah, George, it was about the Omicron, what you've been going on about that COVID general. I mean, it's a bit of a shambles, really. We're living in a world which we're getting inundated with misinformation. There's a lot of fake news going on out there. Now, I'm not anti-vaxxer, George. I've been vaxxed. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. If you don't want to get the vaccine, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. If you don't want to get the vaccine for personal reasons, that's fine. If you don't want to get the vaccine, if you're against the government, that's fine. What I have a problem with is that people are getting misinformation and claiming that they have some sort of knowledge on the general public that have had the vaccine. You're going to die. Some of the rhetoric that I've heard over the last 2 years.
A lot of people have gone crazy over this issue, Darren. I haven't looked at the comments tonight, but when I do, I'll discover really significant numbers of people that have clearly gone mad in the course of this pandemic. I think mental health has been very gravely affected.
You took the words right out of my mouth, George. Mental health has declined drastically in the last 2 years. It's you know, and a lot of the time there, a lot of people have just been in isolation, and that causes a lot of problems.
Yeah.
I understand the grief. That I understand from both sides of the street.
Yeah.
You know, but we must get united. I think it's pulling us apart. It's causing so much division. You know, I look at United States politics and I see the division there. And it's happening here. There's a lot of division going on. You're either vaccinated or you're not, and there seems to be
Well, the overwhelming number of people, Darren, are vaccinated. Over 90% of us are vaccinated. And as I said earlier, I'd be a liar if I said that the vaccinations have worked as well as I'd hoped they would work. They haven't. On the other hand, the virus, especially now that it has morphed into the Omicron, isn't as bad as I originally feared that it was going to be. It's life, isn't it? That things are never as good or as bad as they first appear.
We're coming from the standpoint, George, that the government had a hand on this from day one, which they've never had a hand on it. They've never been in control of any of this, you know. It's been a shambles.
If only they had been. They had plenty of time to act, and they didn't act. And the government have mishandled this whole thing, ably assisted by the opposition, who have done no opposing at all. Darren, thanks for the call. Top call. Malcolm in Edinburgh, probably the last call, maybe not. Go ahead, Malcolm.
Last call. Fantastic, George. You're looking dapper as ever. I've got two quick points for you, George. First one is, I think we're political pawns. I think that Drakeford and Sturgeon are forcing Boris's hands with their political independence agendas, and Boris has to follow suit, because if it turns out bad in England, Drakeford and Sturgeon can say, see, I told you, and we're looking after you. That's my first point.
There's not, I don't know much about Wales, Malcolm, but Scotland's outcomes are catastrophically bad. Worse than anywhere else in the United Kingdom, and amongst the worst in the whole world. So I'm not sure how Nicola Sturgeon could make any political profit out of the coronavirus. As a matter of fact, she might end up on trial over the care home scandal.
My point on that, George, is that do you not think that she's taking an angle to lock down harder and lock down faster with a view for her getting an independent benefit from it? It's got nothing to do with the good of the population of Scotland.
Yeah.
It's all about her personal agenda.
Will that profit her politically, Malcolm?
Of course, because if 1 in 100,000 people die in Scotland and 10 in 100,000 people die in England, she's won. She's looked after her population. So Boris has to follow suit, because he doesn't want no Prime Minister of England, of the UK, wants to be responsible for independent Scotland or Wales or Ireland.
Okay, powerful point. Thanks for making it. There is time for one last call. Kenny in Acton on the Labour Party. Go ahead, Kenny.
Good evening, George. I never actually said I wanted to talk about the Labour Party, to be honest. I don't know how it says that.
That's what it says. Just speak about what you wanted to speak about then.
Okay, I want to say a special thank you to the capitalist system for my new 55-inch Samsung 4K TV.
Well,
and
that sounds nice. I mean, not everything about capitalism is bad. I would just argue that we could produce these 55-inch Samsung televisions without Mr. Samsung. It's the workers that made it, not Mr. Samsung.
I guess so, but George, I'm a little bit dumbfounded with the prospect of this new lockdown, so I didn't really know what to say. I just want to sing a Christmas song to cheer you and your listeners up.
Go on then, go on.
Okay, here we go.
What happened to the Christmas song?
Here. I'll have a blue Christmas without you. I'll be so blue just thinking about you. Decorations of red on a green Christmas tree won't be the same, dear, if you're not here with me. And when those blue snowflakes start falling, that's when those blue memories start calling. You'll be doing all right with your Christmas in white, but I'll have a blue Christmas.
Kenny, I've got news for you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, totally brilliant. Now listen.
Cheers, man.
Because we had to cancel our Christmas party, I've come up with the idea of having a mother of all talk shows convention somewhere in England. We'll take a hotel for the whole day on a Saturday. We'll film it. We'll bring people like Kenny to sing. In fact, we'll have a karaoke. We'll have a dance. We'll have.
Sounds great. I'm in.
We'll have the the best callers, everyone who has listened, participated, watched, and who wants to come will be very welcome. More details on that. In March, I'm showing my Kelly film in Liverpool. Details coming up about that. But most of all, I want to wish every single one of you a very peaceful Merry Christmas.